The story begins on a less than positive note. A large, overweight man is shouting angrily at a young, fair-haired girl, accusing her of dishonoring their family name. The girl's name was Maldanika, and her most remarkable feature, apart from her long golden hair, was her large green eyes, like cut emeralds. But the main character was not Maldanika Babaloa herself, but the woman who had entered her body. And she even agreed with something, because the real aristocrat really turned out to be a disgusting businesswoman, losing huge amounts of money. Of course, the insidious stepmother, the red-haired Duchess Hildegard, played a certain role in this, but the main reason was the blonde's catastrophic lack of talent in business. As for the Duke himself, he simply hated his daughter to such an extent that he would not, in principle, believe even the most logical and credible excuse. In the end, his lordship's patience snapped. He threw a wad of money at the protagonist, contemptuously ordering her to get out, and the young aristocrat accepted the handout with the greatest dignity, carefully stroking the precious papers, as if they were a pedigree cat. The main character said with emphasis on slowness, "Yeah, I also hope to never see you again." This enraged the man even more than before. Choking from the rage that was overwhelming him, he croaked out who this brat even thought she was. But Maldanika only gave her father a cold, contemptuous look. The young woman who ended up in the younger Babaloa understood that she was walking on thin ice. The real noblewoman always threw tantrums whenever her father even hinted at separation. And now he sees how the hated child calmly accepts expulsion from its cozy nest, without showing even a hint of resistance. Here, anyone would suspect a serious catch, but the girl was not going to change her mind in any case, and so she decided to use a surefire trump card. Just play the fool who was leaving because she was told to. The venerable Duke Babaloa remained sitting in his chair with his mouth open, while Maldanika was internally triumphant. She herself was just waiting for the opportunity to be expelled from the clan. Trying to have the last word, the man angrily shouted that his daughter should not even try to beg him for forgiveness and to take her under her wing in the future. "This will not happen!" For a moment, the protagonist froze and very slowly looked over her shoulder. For a moment, she went cold with contempt and anger, but then she put on a beaming smile and said to her dearest daddy, "Okay, bye-bye." A very short period of time passes, and here, the blonde is standing in the middle of her room in a simple travel dress, surrounded by plump suitcases, wondering if she took everything. Maldanika was a little nervous and tried to get it done as quickly as possible, because she was seriously afraid that Hildegard, having pestered her husband for the money she had given her daughter, would show up at any moment to take it away. At this point, the maid entered the young duchess's chambers. Trying not to scream in horror, she asked how her mistress could go somewhere looking like that, and in such a terrible snowstorm. It was Rosaline, the only maid who liked the younger Babaloa. But that didn't stop the main character from pointing out that it was, in fact, a warm, sunny March outside, and flowers were growing on the trees. As for the goal, Maldanika answered simply, "I'm going after a dream." And this made the maid turn pale with horror, and then in a trembling voice ask whether the girl was going to see Duke Hessman, whoever this man was. The thought that the blonde wanted to propose to him genuinely frightened Rosalind. Even the best actor could not fake such a sweaty, frightened face. At first, the noblewoman did not understand what was being talked about, but then she remembered that, yes, the real owner of the body in which she found herself really did dream of marrying this man. But this heroine didn't need such happiness for free. She wasn't going to be like the protagonists of other short stories and dance around all sorts of northern dukes who have fewer emotions than a piece of ice. But of course, she couldn't tell the truth to Maldanika's maid, so she simply pretended that she had fallen out of love with Gessman. Well, you know, those fleeting youthful feelings that were there yesterday and have evaporated today. The maid may have been consoled by this, but then another question arose in her mind. If the younger Babaloa was not going to run away down the aisle, then what exactly was she dreaming about so much that she was ready to leave home? From the brief exposition, it became clear that the action takes place in a rather formulaic fantasy novel about forbidden love between the aforementioned Gessman and the main character Sharia, a bright girl with pink hair. The protagonist, although she had read the novel, did not have any particularly fond feelings for it. She even noted in her thoughts that its title actually had no relation to the main plot line. It's a completely different matter, with the real Maldanika, Sharia's half-sister, to whom the author assigned the role of the original daughter-in-law of the cold, withdrawn, and simply stereotypical duke. And she, naturally, became the stereotypical jealous villain who plotted against her hated rival, and in the end managed to die in the most absurd way possible, by cutting off her own head. As for the newcomer, she naturally came into incredible horror and shock as soon as she realized that she had ended up in a strange world and in a strange body. But no matter how much she fought, she could not find a way home. The newly minted Maldanika Babeloa decided to stop her fruitless attempts and, being a practical human, focused on teaching the laws and realities of her new home. And in the very first days, the girl firmly decided for herself that she didn't give a damn about the original author's plot. This was now her story, and it would develop the way the main character wanted. And the move, among other things, helped the protagonist realize what she really wanted from life, what she wanted from early childhood, even if she didn't admit it. Even as a schoolgirl, she looked with incredible envy at the shelves of various department stores and shops, which were almost bursting with different kinds of candies and other sweets. The people who worked in those establishments were not empty spaces or faceless servants for the future traveler, as they were for many customers. On the contrary, in her eyes, they were magicians, creators of miracles. All these thoughts excited and worried the girl so much that she finally returned to reality, and with the most determined look grabbed the handles of her suitcases. However, Maldanika was not so mean as to turn around and leave the only person who cared about her without a word. And so Babeloa confessed to Rosalind that she wanted to open a stationery store. Yes, that's exactly what the protagonist dreamed of. Not to take over the world or marry a prince, but simply to give other children the same happy memories of shopping that she had. The maid herself, however, was so astonished by this that she was unable to articulate 2 words clearly. And then, with the most determined look, she blocked the mistress's path to the door. Feeling like a participant in some kind of ridiculous farce, the maid admitted with an awkward smile that she simply did not understand what the noble lady was talking about now. She remembered well how all the previous attempts of the real Maldanika to go into business had ended, and the realization that the mistress wanted to try again made the faithful servant tremble. The protagonist, however, interpreted this surprise in her own way. She remembered that in this dimension, no one had yet thought of creating a store where children, not adults, would buy pens, paper, writing knives, and the like. In other words, she would not just be the owner of her own small business, but would be revolutionizing the world of business. And this realization inspired Babeloa incredibly. However, Maldanika, of course, was not a complete fool and understood perfectly well the maid's true fears. She was afraid that the mistress would fail this time too, and she would no longer have the support of her family to cover the losses. The maid tried to explain this, warning that if she failed, the Duchess would no longer have the means to wear luxurious dresses, but this did not frighten the newcomer at all. Rosalind, sweating a little from fear and tension, tried to make a more compelling argument. Another ruin could lead to Babeloa having to eat bread and buckwheat for the rest of her life, like a commoner. However, the protagonist found a counter-argument to this. She actually loves buckwheat porridge and rye bread, so for her, this will not be a fate worse than death itself. Then she carelessly advised the black-haired maid to simply not worry so much about every trivial matter, and unceremoniously pushed the girl aside to pass. Then the poor maid gave in. With tears in her eyes, she warned her young mistress that Duchess Hildegard might want to punish her again, and few people would want that. As it turned out, this was not an exaggeration at all. In the past, the older woman had indeed been beaten by the younger one, and Rosalind would very much not want this to happen again. In an effort to console the only person who could be called a friend without a stretch, Maldanika asked the maid to simply stop being nervous. She had already decided everything for herself. However, behind this carefree facade, Babeloa was absolutely serious. She harbored a deep grudge against her stepmother and was no longer going to bend under her despotic rules. But now, opening the gates to a new life, the young blonde promised Rosalind that she would definitely invite her to visit if the idea of a children's store took off. The protagonist, of course, did not go out straight into the street, but into the large, luxurious hall of the mansion. Numerous maids and visitors had already gathered there, discussing various matters and gossip. Looking again at the suspicious servant, the newcomer admitted that the brunette was simply afraid that the young woman, raised in an aristocratic environment, would certainly get into trouble if she found herself in the outside world without the protection of the elite. But in reality, Maldanika was much more afraid of staying at home, considering it a much closer and more inevitable path to death. Because that's how the world works. If something interferes with the love of the main characters, this something inevitably dies. However, the now former Duchess was not going to meekly wait for her predetermined fate, like a lamb to the slaughter, and she decided to rebel against the author's world. And the visitors were already spreading poisonous gossip about the departure of the protagonist and the family curse, which had its roots in an ancient legend about how Maldanika's ancestor, on her mother's side, was brought to a hard fate by a vengeful dragon. It is not known how much of this was true and how much was false, but all of that man's relatives subsequently died at a young age, including the first wife of the Duke of Babaloa and the mother of the heroine. Someone else might have been upset or angry to hear these disgusting snake whispers, but the time traveler didn't really care about these high-born hyenas. Moreover, she had absolutely no reason to love the parents of the real Maldanica. Both her father and stepmother treated her like dirt and pushed her to a tragic death. Therefore, the Earthling was sure that if a real young duchess at some point had a choice, whether to curse her hated relatives in order to save her own skin, she would have agreed without hesitation. With such heavy thoughts, the blonde finally stepped out of the estate, where a coachman was patiently waiting for her, sitting on the box of a luxurious carriage decorated with floral patterns. The court sycophants, meanwhile, were not about to calm down. Now they were mocking the woman for leaving without an escort, and thanks to this, Babaloa stepped into the carriage with even greater willingness. She gave the coachman instructions to head to the outskirts, but before the structure moved forward, a blonde with a suspiciously familiar face opened the window. All the gossips and onlookers gathered in the courtyard, attracted by the unusual spectacle. And Maldanika, of course, could not resist giving these scoundrels the middle finger and telling them to go to hell. The protagonist finally felt truly free, not constrained by the idiotic, hypocritical rules of the aristocracy, and she spent the rest of the evening in such an elevated mood. The carriage still continued to move. The horses led it forward without noticeable signs of fatigue, and the young coachman, himself as hardy as a horse, gently urged them forward. Looking out the window at the darkening landscape, young Babaloa finally thought about what to do next. Because the first stage of the plan, to escape from the hated house, was completed. Many people will be happy about this, but especially Hildegard. Now she will be able to easily organize a wedding between her blood daughter, Sharia, and this ice block Hessman. But the red-haired slut will still try to destroy her stepdaughter, as she has done many times in the past. Maldanika's very existence is like an eyesore to her, and so the traveler understood very well that she needed to find a loyal bodyguard as soon as possible, if she didn't want to wake up one day as a ghost and find her own body on the bed with a slit throat. For an ordinary person, even one with power, this would have been a serious problem. But the protagonist had the advantage of knowing the plot, and she already knew where to find the best knight in the entire empire. To do this, she asked the coachman to stop so she could get off the train. In the middle of an ancient, partially destroyed cemetery, which seemed to have been created for the filming of a horror movie, Maldanika got out of the carriage with pleasure, looking at all this gloomy situation. But the poor servant looked as if he was afraid to see a vampire behind any bush. Babaloa explained to the coachman with a smile that this was the destination she needed, and even allowed herself a dark joke on the topic of, "I won't find any ghosts here, will I?" The man clearly thought his employer was crazy, but he didn't dare argue. Wishing her luck, he jumped back onto the box and led the horses further down the road. After watching him for a few seconds, the protagonist thought that she had nothing to fear from ghosts. She had already died once, which made her partly a ghost herself, and then the heroine moved on. Thousands of years ago, an army of bloodthirsty demons descended from the divine dimension and attempted to take over the human world. And they were very close to victory, with mortals drowning in blood. And of course, following the laws of the genre, a certain hero appeared out of nowhere, who had the miraculous ability to kill evil spirits as if they were ordinary people and animals. In the end, this man single-handedly ended the fight by simply locking the devilish hordes in a magic blade. But to do this, the noble knight had to sacrifice his own life. Of course, The memory of this man was not forgotten. The descendants of those people compose legends, fairy tales, and fables about him. But the hero himself is in some sense alive, as a guard and living seal of his own blade. Remembering this, Maldanika looked around very carefully. Suddenly, at some point, her gaze would notice a clue indicating that the right place was right here. Babaloa did indeed quickly discover the legendary blade, stuck into one of the old graves, like a tombstone. Just come up and pull it out, whoever wants to. According to the plot, he was supposed to be discovered much later by Duke Hessman, becoming even more popular among people. But, naturally, it couldn't be otherwise, since he was the author's favorite. Then there will be another conspiracy against the current sovereign, and the rebels will want to make a northerner their new ruler, as if there were no other candidates in the empire except this living template. Unfortunately for him, the newcomer needed the blade much more, so she, using all the strength available in her fragile body, pulled the weapon out of its stone captivity. It was like a flashbang effect. Everything around was filled with an unearthly light, and when the blonde dared to open her eyes, a strange man was in front of her. This was the chosen hero. And since the author was not chasing originality, the ancient warrior turned out to be very young, almost a boy, with black hair and bright blue eyes. As it turned out, the part about almost was unnecessary. This man, Dominic, was a boy. He was only 17 years old when he saved the world and single-handedly defeated an army of bloodthirsty demons. At first, the man said nothing. He looked at his old weapon for a long time, until it scattered into sparks in his fingers, and then laconically asked who Maldanika was. Then a slightly awkward acquaintance began. Babaloa spontaneously introduced herself, and then asked if the brunette really was the legendary demon fighter. The young man cautiously confirmed that this was so, and asked for what purpose his centuries-old fast had been broken, and the former duchess, with shining eyes, replied that she wished to conclude a contract. In response, Dominic only sighed heavily and looked down, as if he were an incredibly tired, burnt-out person who was being asked to work another overtime shift. And so it was. He complained out loud that people in principle do not change, and Maldanika simply wants to use him as a weapon. But the aristocrat did not even bother to deny it. And such a sincere answer, of course, plunged the young but ancient warrior into deep shock. He could only widen his eyes, as if an invisible enemy had hit him on the back of the head with a club. The swordsman, however, appreciated that his employer was not being hypocritical, and quickly began a businesslike conversation. What kind of contract this was, and what exactly Babaloa wanted from him. Now the girl looked at her interlocutor with such surprise, as if he had seriously asked what the earth was or what color the sky was. But she quickly came to her senses and asked him to protect her. This was an elementary condition, because a warrior bound by a contract is obliged to protect his employer even at the cost of his own life. But when it turned out that these were all the requirements, Dominic again fell into a stupor. He simply couldn't believe that he, the greatest warrior and hero in history, was called upon for such a trivial task, to work as a simple bodyguard. Maybe Maldanika actually wants to take over the empire, but is embarrassed to say so? But the protagonist was absolutely serious in this regard. No seizure of empires or the entire world. She didn't even need to play some kind of commander with irrepressible ambitions. The girl could even understand his shock. Almost all self-respecting time travelers call upon great fighters, demons, and monsters to capture everything they see. But she personally just wanted to live and sleep without the fear of getting a sharpening through the ribs. Realizing that the knight would never believe that the reason really was only this, without any hidden pitfalls, the heroine took pity and added that she had another motive. Leaning down so that their faces almost touched, Babaloa announced solemnly that she was opening a store for children next to the academy, so that he, too, would be protected. For a few seconds, the poor teenager simply stared at her in shock, and then sighed stoically, and noted that now he understood everything, so be it. But in reality, the hero again decided that the woman was going to take over or create a country, and then call it a stationery store. And this, in his opinion, was simply a disgusting name. Maldanika, deciding that the ancient warrior had simply gone mad, very slowly, as if he were a fool, explained that she wanted to create a small shop with goods for children. And then she, wearily putting her hand to her face, asked what was the point of being picky at all. The brunette must have dreamed for centuries of being free. And did it really matter to him what he did afterwards? In addition, if the young man manages to fully fulfill the terms of the contract, the seal will fall off completely, and he will again become an ordinary person, left to his own devices. Dominic suddenly asked how the main character knew all this, and only now did she realize that she had spilled a lot more information than was required. But the savvy protagonist quickly replied that it didn't matter, because the guy, after all, gets a unique opportunity for a second chance at a normal life. The teenager thought out loud that this was really good, so good that it was hard to imagine a better option, and Babaloa felt as if she was being ignored. Dominic finally made a decision. Standing up, he took Maldinike, or Mel, as she asked to be called, by the hand and wished her all the best. The blonde's face turned pink, and a sincere smile touched her lips. The second point of her little plan, finding an invincible bodyguard, was clearly fulfilled. Then they shook hands firmly, even solemnly, thereby officially concluding a magical contract. And now neither side had the right to shirk the terms. The girl quickly added that the building she had her eye on for quick conversion into a store had already been chosen, but now she needed to somehow teleport to it. A few minutes passed, and the main characters appeared in front of a huge, ancient estate, no less in size than the ancestral home of the same Dukes of Babaloa. Of course, in reality, this building was not needed. No one would ever have given Maldanisa enough money to buy such luxury. It was the first academy of the empire. Dominic, who remembered this place 1,000 years ago, was filled with nostalgic delight. Everything here had changed a lot over 10 centuries, but it was still beautiful. Accordingly, he also decided that Mel needed the academy, and therefore was genuinely surprised why she did not approach the huge fence, several times taller than a man. Then, a tense silence fell between the two young men. They simply looked intently into each other's eyes, as if each was trying to read the other's thoughts. The knight finally replied, confused, that there were no other buildings in the area. And then Babaloa, smiling, pointed to a tiny house that looked so bad that you could physically feel the filth emanating from the building. After a few minutes of another tense pause, Dominic looked at the academy again and repeated that it was the only building in the area. But the blonde ruthlessly replied that her bodyguard had seen everything he needed to. And then, with the kindest, sweetest smile, she suggested that we go. And it was as if a fresh spring wind blew into the atmosphere, filled with the aromas of flowers and leaves. The poor teenager, however, looked at her with such horror, as if he had been seriously ordered to jump into a huge cesspool full of excrement, and he clearly regretted not staying in the sword. Then the readers were shown a small exhibition. A month after the death of the mother of the real Medelnica, her family was deprived of the title of Marquise with all the privileges. All the wealth of the ancient family, naturally, subsequently settled in the pockets of the main character's father, this greedy, pig-like, and evil old man. However, there was one thing that eventually went to the protagonist, and not to anyone else, like the elder Babaloa or his ruthless second wife. It was not some kind of jewelry or clothing, as one might expect. It was an ordinary house, which had clearly seen much more prosperous days in the past. And the newcomer, of course, knew that the family nest had been abandoned. But she didn't think that everything was so bad that the unfortunate Dominic would want to die just by looking at it all. The blonde pondered out loud for a moment on how best to set up the future enterprise before noticing that the bodyguard was looking too long and wildly. Trying to give his voice its usual cold firmness, the swordsman asked whether he would have to sleep and eat in this house covered in cracks and cobwebs, and Maldanika simply answered, "Yeah." The unfortunate warrior fell into despondency again, when he was not afraid to go out alone against the army of demons and sacrifice himself to protect others. But this was too much for him. The man stood for a while with his head down, like a ruffled crow, and then very slowly, and in a strange voice, he declared that he had been deceived. Dominic began to glare at his employer with a very angry look, so much so that if it were possible to kill people in this way, that would be the end of the story. Mentally lamenting the fact that the greatest hero in the world was such a grumpy grouch, Mel gently touched his shoulder and asked him not to be so angry. She knew what to do about it. The girl had a very ambitious dream, to become not just the owner of the first stationery store for children, but the owner of the best stationery store in general. Dominic only narrowed his eyes and opened his mouth in response. Such a disgusted grimace spoke better than any words about what the man thought about what was happening around him. He noted that all swindlers behaved like that. But okay, for now, everything could be considered normal. And Babaloa, seething with optimism, dragged the knight to the estate. Turning around, the brunette promised to finish off the blonde if she didn't keep her promise about payment. And the protagonist almost melted with affection, as if she were seeing an angry but cute kitten. At that moment, the hero reminded the traveler of Maldenika's late older brother, but the warrior himself, in an irritated tone, ordered her to stop looking at him like that. To the innocent question of what he meant, the warrior angrily replied that the blonde's face read, "Kia, what a cutie!" But, grumbling and rubbing his face, he began to look even more beautiful. Surprised at how observant her new guard was, the protagonist decided to drop the subject, and then they both went down to explore the basement. It looked as disgusting inside as it did outside. Some necropolises are more beautiful, but Mel still felt happy because it was, after all, her own home. She began to ask Dominic if this wasn't a wonderful place, dancing like a Disney princess, and the young man once again noted that he had been deceived and that his employer was completely sick in the head. He even began to pray to God, asking why the Almighty had abandoned him, to which Maldenika, with a very sarcastic face, asked why religiosity had awakened in the warrior. Not paying any more attention to his suffering, the blonde began to fantasize about how she would arrange everything after finishing cleaning, how they would have cabinets with candies over there and shelves with scrolls over there. Babaloa was in that state when a person no longer really pays attention to the world around her, completely immersed in her own fantasies. It was as if stars were floating around her. Such was her delight. She actually saw it, as if it were real. Dozens of happy little rascals running around, cackling happily, while she watched with a smile, and Dominic carried things. And this picture was enough to make the newcomer smile with genuine happiness, as if her most cherished wish had just come true. The great hero looked thoughtfully at her enthusiastic reaction, quietly replied, "Okay," and then cast some kind of spell that summoned a ball of light into his hand. The young man calmly suggested giving the order to do something for this, while there were still no stationery stores, and the woman lit up with happiness no worse than that magic ball. Then the main character began to suggest one idea after another. There was one about a large sign so that the establishment could be identified and noticed from afar, and about working around the clock. And then the readers finally discovered the reason why the former Earthling cares so passionately about children and sees stores as a source of joy. She was simply an orphan, without parents or any other relatives, and only compassionate teachers prevented the little girl from ending up at the bottom of society. And also the various employees of the aforementioned shops, of course. For example, one day a good-natured woman just offered the then little protagonist a lollipop. Of course, a child from a complete and fairly well-off family would not have seen anything special in this and would probably have forgotten about it in a few days. But for a lonely little girl, it was an outlet. Naturally, she had a lifelong association that such stores are beacons of light and a kingdom of goodness, where any child can feel true happiness. Now, while the stars sparkled in the night skies of the alternate reality and comets fell majestically, Maldenika thought about how the children here lived, what they wanted, and what they dreamed about most of all. And she, of course, continued cleaning, commanding Dominic. The girl enthusiastically ordered the warrior to use this or that spell, while the brunette did everything with a detached look. While the years of dust evaporated by the will of magic, and the frightened spiders fled from the burning web, Babaloa continued to think that she would very much like to become the same source of joy for the local children as the adult sellers were in her world. At that moment, the blonde and the brunette did not look like a mistress and a servant who had decided to live and work together for mutual benefit. Rather, they looked like an old married couple who were always ready to lend each other a shoulder, no matter how many quarrels there were between them. Thus passed a beautiful, full moon night, and a bright morning came. The sun rose above the horizon again, painting the sky a delicate blue, and the inhabitants of a certain huge castle were already hurrying about their business. Of course, such a huge and expensive building could not belong to some merchant or even a rich aristocrat. It was the home of the emperor himself, and Maldenika, getting out of the carriage, cast a close look at the palace. Babiloa had business here, but in order to leave her new home, she had to persuade her bodyguard to turn into a sword again, and also choose a moment when there would be as few prying eyes and ears in the area as possible. Although the city center is usually the source of the most excitement, here and now it was extremely quiet. A man was walking nearby, not paying attention to the protagonist, and a contented cat was walking with a fish in its mouth. And these were simply wonderful conditions for officially opening her store. The main character simply could not be less happy when fate itself smiled so warmly at her. But then she stopped and very slowly, even with some apprehension, turned around, because a man in a black suit suddenly approached her and quietly said, "Well, hello, long time no see." It turned out to be the main character of the original plot, the ever-memorable Duke of the North, Hessman. Outwardly, he resembled Dominic, but biologically, he was much older, larger, and with dark eyes that looked like pieces of dark quartz. This man's name was Lennox, and from the outside, he even looked friendly. However, Maldanika, having barely met the gaze of her unloved fiancé, mentally groaned, "Lord, but why now? For what?" Babeloa was usually invisible to those around her, and the traveler took advantage of this with pleasure. But she had the misfortune to stumble upon such a person, and at a time when secrecy was simply necessary. But for the purpose of disguise, the protagonist pushed all her displeasure as deep as possible and made an elegant greeting bow, not taking her wary gaze off the brunette. Coming very close, Gisman quietly added how rumors had reached him about the main character leaving her family and being stripped of her noble title. And this irritated him greatly, because the man did not remember when he had given his bride permission to do such things. The atmosphere changed as if lightning had struck between the two people. The blonde froze like a pillar of salt with fear, and Lennox, wearily rubbing his forehead, ordered her to return home within a month because he did not want to marry some tramp. He coldly asked if Maldanika had forgotten that they would soon be getting married, and these words no longer frightened the newcomer, but on the contrary, she became clearly angry. After this, the action pauses briefly again so that the protagonist, who is also the narrator of the story, can explain some subtleties to the audience. In this case, she reveals that the northern aristocrat initially behaved very kindly to the real Babeloa. One day, they met in a sunny greenhouse full of flowering plants, and the blonde, looking down in embarrassment, asked if the Duke hated her. In response, Lennox only dropped to one knee, tenderly kissed the girl's hand, and quietly asked how he could, if he had spent his whole life looking for a woman like her, Maldanika. And while the young duchess was trying to regain control of her own breathing, the brunette good-naturedly allowed her to call him not by his title and surname, but simply by his first name, as if they were old friends. This brought the young aristocrat to tears. She had spent her entire life under the thumb of a greedy, vile, and heartless father, had endured insults and attacks from her stepmother for years, and then finally a man appeared who showed warmth to her. Unfortunately, the unfortunate blonde fell into the standard trap of an abuser, like many young people before her. As soon as she got close enough to Gessman, his attitude towards his bride changed radically, and for the worse. He began to insult, humiliate, and venomously criticize everything that Maldanika did. He called her costumes tasteless, belittled any achievements and talents, scolded her for wrong actions. And perhaps his most unpleasant act was that Lennox constantly compared his fiancée to her own half-sister, Sharia, using literally any excuse to humiliate the former in favor of the latter, despite knowing how much the poor girl suffered from low self-esteem. However, now her body is controlled by a completely different, much more resilient personality. But even the time traveler was not pleased to think that the poor girl had to go through much worse things. As if to further trample the remnants of his bride's pride and dignity, Gessman began dating that same Sharia, without even trying to hide it. To be fair, the woman really loved the brunette, and did not wish harm to her half-sister, and the Duke himself had warm feelings for her. But this did not stop him from using his mistress as another way of bullying. It is no secret that the palaces of the nobility are like small villages. Each person there is in full view of each other, so rumors quickly began to spread that Lennox was cheating on Maldanika. In the end, the main characters still began to hide their relationship, so as not to become a favorite and constant topic of discussion among gossips. but no one even thought about ending the affair. And the unfortunate blonde could only continue to watch as the man she once truly loved treated her like dirt. And it was not hard to understand why in the original novel she wanted to kill her traitorous sister. At some point, she plucked up the courage to approach her fiancé and quietly ask if there really was nothing between him and Sharia, and if the nasty rumors were just lies. In response, the Grand Duke only rolled his eyes in pain and declared that even if these rumors were true, only Maldanika herself would be to blame for his betrayal, because she was a sad, suffering mediocrity. Most people would have been furious and would have scratched Lennox's eyes out, or at least slapped him, if they had heard something like that. But Babaloa tried to justify herself or explain herself through tears. However, it was enough for Hesman to simply ask in an icy tone whether the woman wanted to go against his words for the poor man to turn to stone, as if from the gaze of Medusa the Gorgon. The aristocrat nobly assured her that he would marry Maldanika in any case, so she should not worry about any nonsense. And the unfortunate woman correctly understood that the upcoming marriage would be an endless nightmare for her. And the author did not provide his heroine with salvation from this. Lennox easily manipulated the younger Babaloa, and with each passing day only plunged the victim deeper into the abyss of despair. And the scoundrel did all this with a charming grin, playing the noble savior, reaching out his hand to a man at the bottom of a deep hole, but in fact only burying him even deeper. The canonical Maldanika gave up, completely abandoning any struggle. She effectively turned into a gray, trembling shadow with her despotic husband, who continued to cheat on her with Sharia. This made the time traveler incredibly angry. She was so overcome with anger and hatred that she squeezed the handle of the blade that Dominic had temporarily turned into with all her might, barely holding back the desire to rip out her fiancé's guts. Gesman and Sharia never stopped their perverted games of love for a second. Right now, the youngest daughter of Duke Babaloa was spending a luxurious vacation in the Northern Territories, warmly thinking about her lover, and Lennox, in response, was counting the days until his beloved woman would return. Unfortunately, the protagonist understood perfectly well that she could not finish off the abuser, no matter how much she hated him, so she had to choose a much more subtle tactic. With a gentle smile, Pseudo-Maldanika informed the Duke that she knew everything, and the brunette, outwardly showing slight concern, sternly asked what they were talking about, but the main character did not answer right away. She thought that it was actually very strange that the real Babaloa did not guess the true state of affairs for so long. After all, if you think about it logically, there must be a good reason why the Duke, despite everything, wants to marry Maldanika and not her sister. And it is unlikely that this is purely a matter of sadism. The protagonist said out loud that she knew about Gesman's relationship with Sharia, but the brunette only said with an arrogant smile that they never got to the point of intimacy, so there was nothing to worry about. The traveler remembered that the woman whose body she was now occupying had tried several times to call off the engagement in the book, but all her attempts had ended in nothing but shameful failure. And the real Maldanika continued to sincerely love Lennox. No matter how much torment she experienced because of him, she simply could not order her heart to stop burning with love. Fortunately, the former Earthling did not suffer from such stupidities, so nothing prevented her from calmly, and even indifferently, declaring that she was not interested in such excuses. She didn't care what the brunette would say next. She would do everything in her power to break off the engagement. And the usually calm, self-satisfied Duke looked at his victim with genuine surprise. In a very slow and quiet voice, the man asked what that was all about, as if he was currently struggling with the desire to slap the girl in the face as punishment for her rebellion. But the protagonist was not afraid of him at all, and even on the contrary, she mockingly clapped her hands, feigning surprise, and suggested that Gesman simply get engaged to Sharia. In theory, then Lennox would get what he wanted anyway, an alliance between two powerful families, but he repeated that he did not want to marry the younger sister. He only wanted the older one. As if in passing, he tried to humiliate his future wife again by telling her how wonderful her sister was. But now there was a completely different person in Maldanika's body, and she didn't give a damn. However, the aristocrat repeated that he only wanted a blonde as his legal wife, and the main character felt that her strategy was noticeably failing, so she decided to herself that if His Northern Highness, despite everything, was going to drag her down the aisle, then Babaloa would make every effort to make Gesman howl like a wolf from his new married life. And as a mockery, the newcomer, with feigned indifference, suggested that Lennox in that case marry Lady Hildegard herself. She is an old woman, but still in her prime, and Maldenica would never put a ring on her finger. Some fan of mommies would even be happy with such a proposal. But the brunette, judging by his stunned face, did not consider a 30-year age difference acceptable for marriage. But one had to give the nobleman credit. He controlled his emotions very well and did not explode with indignation. On the contrary, he only asked even more calmly what the blonde was trying to achieve with such behavior. And he wasn't the only one, to be honest. Dominic, who continued to remain in the form of a sword and heard everything, also became nervous, not understanding what his employer was dragging him into. But the girl quietly promised to pay extra for it. To do this, she had to slightly expose the blade of the sword. And Lennox, of course, took it completely differently. Staring at the weapon, he asked the bride in a completely icy tone why she was taking out a weapon on the street. The disguised hero asked with even greater concern what Babaloa was going to do. But the blonde, having fully drawn her blade, only replied that she had to obey. She thrust the tip of the weapon hard into the pavement and breathed heavily, like an old woman leaning on a stick, but added when she had caught her breath, "I don't think you get it." Looking Hessman straight in his cold, dark eyes, the woman repeated with the most decisive expression that she was breaking off her engagement with him, and doing so in an official manner. In the world of the work, such a gesture of driving a weapon into the ground clearly meant a challenge to a duel. In this way, the girl demonstrated her determination. Having pulled the unfortunate Dominic in the form of a sword out of the pavement, the protagonist turned around and began to leave, but promised to send her failed fiancé a farewell letter later, and she calmly left after that. Lennox did not try to stop the main character in any way, did not try to grab her by the shoulders or angrily shout after her, as if surprise left him completely paralyzed. As it turned out a second later, that was exactly how it was. The Duke, who had been used to establishing dominance over those around him all his life, now looked exactly like his former victim, depressed and frightened. To reassure himself, the young aristocrat decided to think that this was not really a breakup, but simply a vile feminine tactic to attract attention, and he, of course, would not fall for it. Gesman tried to convince himself that Maldenica was completely under his control, that she would never run away anywhere, although he painted her in his image as happy and joyful. And he also correctly understood that something was not right here. Such a woman could not have completely changed in one moment. Something serious had to happen. And Lennox stared intently after Babaloa. The girl, as if sensing this gaze, turned around sharply, and the Duke grinned triumphantly. Well, of course, he had trained his new pet perfectly. It could not seriously try to bite its owner. The protagonist slowly approached the guy and quietly said that she forgot to tell him something. But Gesman coldly interrupted her, saying that he did not need an apology. Such impudence made the traveler fall out of reality for a few seconds, sincerely not understanding what she had to apologize for. And then she sarcastically noted that if Lennox had been the same kind of pig in the novel, and not just a stereotypical, poorly written character, the author would have gone broke. The protagonist smiled slyly and leaned forward slightly. She was not the old, downtrodden Maldenica. She would write the plot according to her own rules, and now she was about to tell her fiancé something important. The young Duke looked at Babaloa with a completely indifferent gaze in response, the way many people look at furniture that needs to be patched up so that it can continue to serve well. The girl began by saying that Gesman most likely thought that their divorce was nothing more than a cheap feminine tactic to attract attention, to make the distant guy love her more. But what does it matter? Lennox thought later. She can't really leave me. I've trained her like a dog. And in reality, the man's eyes widened, unable to believe that his bride had somehow guessed his every thought. When Maldenica triumphantly finished her speech with the words, "She is head over heels in love with me. There will be no divorce," any hint of complacency completely disappeared from the brunette's face. He was genuinely scared. All he had was enough composure to squeeze out an inarticulate, frightened, "What?" And now the blonde was grinning triumphantly from the fact that she had hit the bullseye every time. Placing her fingers on her chin as if pondering some complex thought, the younger Babaloa calmly, without unnecessary theatrics, reported that it was all a lie. One of the main advantages of being a traveler into a familiar work is that an attentive reader knew perfectly well how a particular character might think and act, but his personality and methods remained a mystery to those around him. In the original novel, the young duke was abandoned by his lover, which left him with terrible wounds to his soul and turned him into such a tyrant. And if the heroine were in Sharia's body, she would never repeat this. But she is a secondary character, so her hands are untied. On the other hand, she still realized that she couldn't go too far. If Gesman turned into a maniacal madman, eager to get a victim at any cost, then even knowledge of clichés and Dominic's bodyguard wouldn't necessarily help. No, she definitely wouldn't want to endure love drama and get a personal stalker, let such happiness go to someone else. However, Babaloa didn't have time to finish this thought, because Lennox grabbed her hand and demanded an answer, whether she had someone else. In response, the woman only sighed wearily and contemptuously. Are all cheaters like that? And are each suspected of the same crime that they themselves commit? And the aristocrat's blood was boiling even more. No composure, no detachment, no indifference. He looked as if he was ready to use his fists at any moment, just to get some kind of answer. Then Maldanika pointed her finger at the first guy she saw, and declared that even marrying a stranger like him was a much better fate than living together with Gesman. Lennox showed emotion again, and this time it was a raging, searing rage. He croaked, "How dare Babaloa treat him like that?" But the blonde picked at her ear lazily, for this was only the first stage of the verbal spanking. Then she asked if the Duke was finally ready to leave her alone, when she demonstrated in the most intelligible way that she didn't give a damn about him, and she added with a happy smile that he should never touch her again, not grab her like a naughty little dog, and not hypocritically accuse her of cheating, because he himself is a huge, stinking piece of shit. After this, readers were shown the main character walking down the street alone. Lennox was nowhere to be seen, and there were no signs of possible injuries on the girl. Oh, to say that she was proud of herself would be a criminal understatement. The time traveler was incredibly happy that she had brought the aristocrat down from the heavens, not even to the earth, but to the dirt, taking revenge for the months, if not years, of suffering of the real Maldaniki. As for Dominic, who still retained the form of a sword, he did not share such excitement. In fact, the ancient hero doubted whether it was worth it to be rude to one of the most powerful and terrible people in the current empire. The protagonist only frowned in bewilderment and scratched her face in response. She didn't think she had done anything out of line. She had simply put an arrogant boor in his place. On the one hand, if she were the Duke, she would definitely want to take revenge, so the risk of a visit from the masters of wetwork could not be ruled out. But, on the other hand, she knew Hessman and understood that the man could simply throw his shame out of his head. In any case, the newcomer was sincerely proud that she had found the strength to resist this scoundrel. Very few people dare to object to abusers and exist under their thumb for the rest of their lives. Dominic thought for a moment and noted that there really was no reason to worry about such a freak, and Babaloa smiled very warmly at her bodyguard before heading off to her original destination, the government office. In the Empire, everything existed according to strict rules, and in order to do any business, it was necessary to obtain a license. But the protagonist was surprised at how quickly she was issued her own. On the other hand, when she arrived, disappointment, detachment, and sadness were evident on the officials' faces. You didn't have to be a mind reader to understand that they were sure that Maldanika would go bust again. Unfortunately for the former dugout, the original owner of her body had already become a real legend among clerks and high society, and a legend in the worst and most farcical sense. But there was a definite plus to this, no matter how you look at it. While all the other people had to stand in line for a long time and go through all the circles of bureaucratic hell, she was immediately given the necessary papers. The protagonist, not being a fool, immediately appreciated how convenient it really is. When everyone sees you as just a talentless idiot, it is very easy to get things done without attracting unnecessary attention. The girl could have mentally celebrated her 2 small victories for a long time, but she was interrupted by an unknown voice. A certain person politely said that Maldanika had dropped a piece of paper. The blonde, without really getting a good look at her mysterious interlocutor, hurried to accept the loss from him with gratitude, but the stranger suddenly asked, "Is that really all you were talking about?" As it turned out, this man had heard her entire argument with the powerful Duke Hessman, and just the mention of this name made Babaloa feel her blood boil in her veins. Even the last lousy pig would be better than this bastard. The unknown person, allowing himself a slight grin, noted that this was actually even funny. And at the same time, readers were shown part of his appearance for the first time. The main character froze, like a machine that had suddenly been switched to the off button. Maldanika tried to remember whether the guy she had randomly poked during that divorce was wearing a white shirt. But when the former Duchess concentrated her gaze and looked carefully ahead of her, she saw no one. The mysterious man in white had disappeared like a ghost. The time traveler blinked in confusion and shook her head, trying to understand what it was all about. But, not having come to any conclusion, she decided to simply not think about it anymore. She no longer planned to come to this office, which meant that the chance of meeting the friendly stranger again was close to zero. And when the protagonist returned to her new home, the day had already turned to sunset. Opening the door, the younger Babaloa was in seventh heaven with euphoria. Now her future store, which until recently had been teeming with spiders and other pests, was clean and sparkling. And of course, we had Dominic to thank for this. Like the good fairies and wizards from Disney cartoons, he used magic to control brooms and pipidastras, making them sweep away dirt. The blonde had Napoleonic plans. She was going to order repairs to the building to fix the foundation, walls and roof, and she also needed to buy groceries and do the interior decoration. For this, oddly enough, one should thank Dad, Duke Babaloa Sr. When he said goodbye, he threw his unloved daughter 200 becquerels, which was a pittance for him. But for the heroine, it would be enough to order a witch repairwoman and the first goods. Dominic did not share such bright delight, which was normal for him. However, this time, the young man looked overly withdrawn and thoughtful, which raised questions in Maldanika. As it quickly turned out, this was also connected with Lennox. For some reason, the ancient warrior was worried about whether that disgusting man really was his employer's fiancé. The main character confirmed this, but quickly and with sincere pleasure, clarified that this was her ex-fiancé. This monster no longer had power over her soul and destiny. For some reason, the blue-eyed swordsman was very surprised by this, and the protagonist assumed that after the contract was concluded, the servant began to feel her emotions, and now he could not understand why there was not an ounce of sadness in Babaloa's soul. But then Dominic simply rubbed his forehead tiredly and quietly said, "My condolences, it happens," as if he were a psychologist tired of listening to other people's problems. And so it was, in fact, the ancient. But at the same time, young knight did not even think to hide that he considered his current position terrible and his mistress a source of problems. The more he talked about it, the wider Maldanika's grin grew. But even she was genuinely shocked when the hero said, "You used such a wonderful sword like me to do terrible things." The time traveler tried to turn everything into a joke, playfully poking the bodyguard with her fists and asking, "Come on, did the Duke offend you more than me?" But the warrior replied that that was not the reason. He was clearly not telling the whole story, and the main character might have gotten to the truth in a different situation. But she suddenly remembered that she had overlooked another important point. A few minutes later, the audience is shown how the protagonist, with rapturous eyes, moves a pen over paper, composing the promised letter about divorce from Gessman. But Maldanika, of course, was not content with simply writing a laconic and dry refusal of marriage. She wanted to pour salt into the wounds of the hated brunette, adding that he should not even come near her. The blonde didn't hesitate to kick her hated relatives in passing, because they still hadn't officially disowned her. Lennox continued to pester her like a huge, disgusting gadfly. Dominic, observing her actions and feelings, wondered out loud, could it really be that a born noblewoman, and one of the most influential and well-born, so sincerely and passionately wanted to lose her title? The protagonist had to admit that her bodyguard was simply not yet capable of understanding his mistress. Yes, he spent most of his life in a long-gone era, but people were always ready to bow down to their superiors. But Maldanika still didn't regret anything. Her father hated her. Her stepmother tried to kill her. Her younger sister had an affair with her elder sister's fiancé, and by her very existence fueled the heroine's inferiority complex. So existence away from these monsters would only be a blessing. In addition, upon transition to the commoner class, her hated marriage to Hesman would be automatically annulled, for where has it ever been seen that a duke would suddenly marry a commoner? But out loud, Babaloa only told Dominic that yes, she was indeed ready to easily give up her elite surname. And besides, she was full of confidence even without her relatives. When the knight asked what confidence he was talking about, the traveler, with a gentle and sincere smile, answered that she had no doubt in her ability to earn her own name in a positive way. And how could it be otherwise when she had such a wonderful partner? From these simple but very warm words, the young brunette opened his eyes wide, and his pale cheeks turned a little pink. It was as if flowers with delicate aromas were blooming in the air. But this beautiful moment was ruined by Mel herself. She thought that, in any case, it was not so important, because she could still return to the aristocracy, and the young man almost fell, feeling this thought. Trying to somehow smooth it over, the young warrior added that in any case, he would remain the main character's loyal blade. And she replied with a grin that this was not even up for discussion. After that, the woman returned to writing the letter, although she still took the time to mentally note how cute this great hero and demon slayer was. Having finished the text and placed it in a beautiful white envelope, Maldanika, now without feigned optimism, thought that all these people really did hate her. Not immediately, but the traveler gradually began to find and remember episodes from the life of the real young Duchess, including those that the author did not describe or even mention in the novel. And as the alien soul settled into the new body, increasingly making it its own, these unpleasant fragments surfaced and became part of it too. For example, the protagonist very clearly, as if it had happened only yesterday, recalled how, when Maldanika was still very little, other children bullied her because of her cursed blood. The poor little girl desperately tried to convince them that she was okay, but in vain. In the eyes of these little monsters, she had already become a degenerate, a vile parasite, and Hildegard played no small role in this. Another time, this same woman, being in the last months of pregnancy, openly told her stepdaughter that she could easily kill her, but for now she was allowing her to live. In response to this, so to speak, mercy, she demanded that the poor girl exist as if she did not actually exist, not to catch the eye, not to distract, not to steal attention, just to be a living thing. The little girl was obviously very scared and hurt to hear this, but she still decided, even though she was looking at the floor, to mutter that for some reason all the neighboring children hated her. It is unknown how Hildegard reacted to this, because the readers were shown how the main character's own father called her stupid, and said that this was why she became a victim of bullying among her neighbors. As the newcomer now admitted, in most cases of bullying, the victim is simply a weak person who is unable to defend himself, but other Babaloa believed that Maldanaka was to blame for her own problems and was getting what she deserved. As for the Duke, this man, among other things, had an ego that exceeded even his fat body in size. He was angry that his daughter was a target for hooligans, but only because it cast a shadow on himself. The bullies, being no fools, realized that some adult thug could soon break their bones, so they left the girl alone. From that day on, everyone began to treat the blonde like a princess, but this was pure hypocrisy. Those around her continued to despise the protagonist, spread poisonous rumors about her, and consider her a degenerate, which forever traumatized the poor child. In order to somehow protect herself, to fence herself off from the world that gave her nothing good, the younger Babaloa decided to become the same as her offenders, a cold, tough, and unapproachable lady from high society. And the time traveler, who was initially a completely different person, was now able to appreciate it as if it had all happened to her personally, and was burning with the desire to rip out the guts of all these bastards. However, she did not lose her cool head and understood perfectly well that at this stage she would not be able to do anything with the powers that be, even with Dominic, a great but solitary knight under her command. Therefore, no matter how unpleasant it is to admit it, the only more or less safe solution is to simply break all ties with the hated relatives and fiancé, postponing revenge until better times. Having settled on this option, the protagonist decided to throw the nasty thoughts out of her head and, stretching sweetly, admitted that she was looking forward to tomorrow with great impatience. But, looking out the window onto the night street, she again plunged into unpleasant thoughts. What if the rest of Babaloa or Guessman decide to send bone breakers after her? Yes, for such a case, she had enlisted the support of the greatest warrior this world had ever seen. But Dominic was alone, and deep down, the traveler was not sure that this would be enough. She could have tormented herself for a long time with unpleasant thoughts about the topic of what if. But in the end, she told herself that she was 100% sure of one thing, and then went to rest until the night gave way to morning. Readers were shown the main characters walking through a door. Maldnika was wearing a beautiful blue dress with a white floral pattern, and her bodyguard was wearing a simple white shirt. The protagonist decided to finish something, but before she could take a single step, Dominic quietly added that yesterday's Duke was indeed a rare bastard. As it turns out, this wasn't just empty talk. Mercenaries have been following them for some time now, pretending to be random passers-by. But Lennox himself is still nowhere to be seen. There were 5 thugs, but perhaps only the most experienced person, accustomed to instantly reacting to danger, would have been able to recognize them, because for the heroine and the readers, there was only a street full of harmless people in the area. The blonde thought about the bodyguard's words, and then remembered her stepmother. This evil woman, most likely, would not calm down either until she sent her to the next world, or at least took aim at her. In other words, she was being hunted from 2 sources at once. Hessman, who wanted to take revenge for the humiliation and take Maldanika as his wife, and Hildegard, who feared that the hated stepdaughter would want to harm her own daughter. Dominic, listening to all these emotions, began to literally burn with rage, so that the girl even had to calm down the faithful guard. And Babaloa noted to herself that it would be even more unpleasant if the hated relatives decided that she had abandoned the Duke for the night. In general, the former aristocrat asked the bodyguard to pretend for now that nothing suspicious was happening, so that the opponents would relax, and the young man in response assured that he was an expert in such things. Then the protagonist thought about the fact that they needed to find the carriage, and the young hero clenched his fist tightly. But he didn't say anything else, and didn't even think. In the end, the main characters decided not to waste time and money on finding a driver, but to walk on foot. But Dominic was even glad about this, because he still could not properly stretch his body after centuries of existence in the form of a weapon. For a while they just walked, talking about this and that. But when the heroine started talking about her plans for the store, the bodyguard suddenly interrupted her, asking her to look to the side. The girl looked, but did not find anything strange. In front of them was a completely empty street and a narrow gateway leading to the other side between the rows of houses. However, having looked closely, Maldanika noticed that an unfamiliar man was lurking around the corner. No, a boy, judging by his build, even younger than 17-year-old Dominic. By all possible assumptions, he did not look like a murderer. This young man wore rich clothes, befitting an aristocrat, and besides, his knee was very badly bruised. Another person would most likely have passed by, suspecting a very sophisticated trap. But Babaloa, unable to ignore the misfortune of an innocent child, rushed to help, even asking the knight to wait aside so that he would not frighten the baby. The protagonist slowly approached the unfamiliar teenager and carefully squatted down in front of him, as if there was a frightened small animal in front of her. Then Maldanika very carefully and tenderly took the stranger by the hand to help him up, but the boy only groaned, admitting that he was unable to walk. A drop of sweat ran down the traveler's temple from anxiety and awkwardness. Lost in conjecture, she suggested calling a doctor so that he could do something about the teenager's injury. The stranger quickly refused, declaring that he did not need a doctor, and at the same time, for the first time, he showed the protagonist and the readers his blue, sapphire-like eyes. He tried to convince Mel that he was just a little tired, but if he was given a little time to regain his strength, he would start running like a gazelle. But the girl quickly began to suspect that the teenager was afraid of the wrath of his own family. There was a barely audible rustling sound behind them. It was Dominic, approaching the corner of the gateway, and he didn't say anything yet. He just looked with his arms folded across his chest. After a few seconds, the brunette came to certain conclusions for himself, after which he simply walked up to the boy and took him onto his back, not listening to objections, although Maldanika, judging by her face, was not at all against it. After this, the action returned to the main character's house. Now it looked much better than before, but still seemed uninhabited and overgrown with wild plants. The traveler carelessly noted that she had not managed to arrange everything here as it should have been, but the young nobleman looked at this place with real horror, as if he had been dragged alive into the underworld. Losing his mind from disgust and fear, the young blonde muttered that he felt like a knight on the battlefield, to which the main character, with a false smile, asked him not to dramatize. Dominic, who was treating the young guest's knee, asked the child not to twitch, and then the boy openly flared up. He shouted that he was not some toddler, but almost an adult knight, and now this squire was desperately trying to prove to those around him, and to himself, that he did not need any help and was not afraid of pain. He was just like a grown man and a warrior. The girl stared at him with genuine surprise, but she quickly realized what was best to do in this situation, and without a hint of irony, she said, "Okay, adult knight, I believe you." Hearing that he was now treated with due respect and not fussed over like hens with a chick, the young blonde blushed and smiled triumphantly, and Maldanika almost lost consciousness. He was so cute. Having come to her senses, the woman only now noticed that the young man was holding something in his hands, some kind of wooden box, similar to a woman's jewelry box. On closer inspection, she realized that it was actually a cardboard package with a picture of a music box on it, and it looked very old and worn. Quietly approaching the boy from behind, Babaloa leaned closer to his ear and enthusiastically asked if their first customer liked such things, since they were so hard to find these days. In response, the young blonde blushed very deeply and looked at Mel with genuine fear. You didn't have to be a telepath to understand that he was ashamed of this burden of his. Somehow forcing himself to speak, he shouted that yes, it was his favorite thing, and let at least one dog try to laugh about it. But the protagonist, raising her hands in a gesture of reconciliation, assured the little boy that she had not even thought of laughing. In fact, the boy didn't like music boxes in general. He was attracted by the fact that this thing was very old, so the girl tried to convince the teenager that a love for antiques is a completely normal and even respectable hobby. The squire was genuinely pleased by this, and he blushed noticeably. But then he became embarrassed again and timidly whispered that he had bought the box for his brother, and he was not sure that his relative would appreciate such a gesture. The traveler mentally admitted that an ancient box was not the best choice as a gift, but she did not want to hurt the young man with such a cruel truth, and therefore assured him that if there was sincere love between relatives, then any gift would be appropriate. And mentally she added, if a person hates you so sincerely, then it doesn't matter what you give him. Even a star from the sky, your gift will still be thrown into the nearest trash can. Then the blonde thought that at first she just wanted to know the boy's name and find out how he managed to hurt his leg like that. But somehow it turned out that they immediately became friends, and the stranger snuggled up to her like a cat. After some time, Maldanika asked Dominic if he had healed all the injuries, and the knight admitted that it was not perfect, but that the young man's health and life should not be in danger. Watching the brunette perform gymnastics exercises, the protagonist was surprised to note how thin he actually was. Not at all like the stereotypical hero of legends, who is usually depicted as a mountain of muscles. And then the ancient knight pointed out that their visitor had become tired. And indeed, the former Babaloa was so distracted that she did not notice how the boy fell asleep on the chair. Having woken him up, the time traveler suggested that the boy not waste his energy and time on calling a carriage and traveling home, but simply take a rest at her place for a few hours, and the teenager easily agreed. But before leaving, the young blonde with a sleepy smile asked if the main characters kept ghosts. Just in case, he wouldn't be surprised by something like that. Taken aback, the heroine tried to assure the guest that everything was fine, and even if there were ghosts here, they would defeat them. But she almost cursed when the naughty boy said, "It's not worth it. A knight must always be brave, even in such an old and nasty house." It was a real blow below the belt, so as soon as Dominic took the child to sleep on the second floor, Maldanika categorically declared it was time to finally turn their house into a full-fledged store. From the outside, it even looked comical. The woman indignantly leaned over, placing her hands on her hips, while her bodyguard simply looked with a thoughtless, empty gaze. When the awkward pause ended, the brunette only asked, "What, so suddenly?" And the former Babaloa nodded imperiously in response, as if to say, "Yes, Exactly that suddenly. In fact, Mel had a simple but effective plan. She shows her beautiful establishment to a few kids. They spread rumors about it, and voila, the door bursts with a flood of customers. Unfortunately for her, Dominic openly admitted that for now these were completely hopeless dreams. Now their house looks so unpleasant that hardly anyone would want to come here of their own free will. Having overcome her monstrous embarrassment, Maldanika cleared her throat and continued to outline the plan of action. First of all, they needed to tidy up the garden outside, and there was a lot of work to be done. Over the decades of neglect, the area had grown so large that it now resembled a small jungle filled with weeds and ivy. And instead of a scythe or a sickle, she was going to use the legendary blade that Dominic had once used to defeat demons. And the young man had initially resisted this, but then resigned himself and began to cut down the pests faster than any lawnmower could. The protagonist looked at this with inexpressible envy. She herself was an ordinary person, so her work progressed extremely slowly and painstakingly. She almost dropped the scissors from her hands when the great hero calmly asked if his mistress had forgotten about the 5 mercenaries who had been following them that morning. The man calmly explained that when they found the teenager, he secretly used mind magic on the bloodhounds to make them go away without resorting to violence. This, one could say, was his little gift to Maldanika for everything she had done for her bodyguard before. And upon hearing this, the blonde quickly and deeply turned pink. Having regained her gift of speech, the protagonist began to praise the guy, claiming how great and awesome he was, while Dominic himself, with false modesty, noted that he had become weaker over the centuries of imprisonment. So they continued cleaning with a feeling of joy and peace in their souls, until Babeloa froze, letting go of the tools from her hands. For a moment, she felt something strange and even creepy, as if some terrible giant was staring at her. Having carefully examined the courtyard, the girl did not find anything even remotely suspicious, only the lawn, still full of weeds, and rows of trees in the distance. Then the blonde glanced down and saw Dominic's blade. And it was precisely this blade that looked so strange and ominous that one could see a supernatural haze emanating from the scabbard. Feeling a whole army of icy goosebumps running across her skin, the newcomer quietly called her bodyguard. But he was still smug from the recent praise and didn't really listen. And then something even more terrible happened. The heroine tried to explain to the brunette that something was wrong, but she simply could not utter the appropriate words, as if someone had taken away her voice. Perhaps this would have been the end of the story, but the instincts of an ancient knight, honed over the years, worked better than any words. Sensing with his skin that danger was nearby, Dominic covered Maldanika, and an instant later, reality itself exploded above them. It didn't even look like a normal explosion. It was more like someone had collected all the darkness from the universe, condensed it into a tiny point, and then let it go. And even the caustic Babeloa couldn't find the words to describe it. And a few seconds later, it became known that this was not even the worst thing. After all, what was happening was not the result of black magic, but the consequence of the fall of the seal on the blade, which until that moment continued to hold the demons inside. The main characters were not destroyed on the spot, only because Dominic's holy magic had so far contained the spreading filth, not allowing it to cross the line. But even his powers were not limitless. Sharp shards of ice also flew in all directions, and the man ordered the woman to dodge. But the protagonist, having taken a closer look at the strange ice that did not melt in the warm spring weather, refused. She explained that the safest thing to do was to simply stay close to the wizard knight, rather than hop around like a wounded rabbit. But then a strange, supernatural voice suddenly sounded in her head. The blonde froze, unable to move even a finger, and the disembodied voice seemed to ask itself questions. Was it really she who had signed the contract? Before answering itself that Babelo needed to be killed. And immediately after that, the protagonist's body was pierced by a terrible pain, as if some crazy invisible being had pounced on her, started hitting her wherever his gaze fell, and strangling her. Dominic noticed this immediately, but he could not tear himself away so as not to destroy the barrier, and the invisible spirit continued to kill Maldanika, promising that with her death, he would be able to carry out his revenge. Everything was swimming before the blonde's eyes. Her vision was clouded. The words were heard as if through a thick row of walls, and the heroine could only clearly perceive the young man who had risked throwing away his support behind the screen. For a moment, the former Earthling thought that she would really die right here and now, but then the illusion disappeared, and she, supported by Dominic, wheezed terribly, swallowing air. The young man said that he would not allow the newcomer to die before his eyes, and then he turned his terrible, piercingly cold gaze to the side, as if trying to find and kill an invisible enemy. And so it was. Thanks to his magical senses, the warrior had no trouble finding the mysterious demon, and then something like a magical battle began, but the enemy still remained invisible and intangible. These supernatural flashes, lights, and glitter of ice continued for some time before the darkness dissipated, replaced by a white haze, and through it, a horned silhouette appeared. The demon looked at his human form with disgust, unable to believe that he had been locked in such a wretched vessel. But Dominic was not going to give him time to complain, and immediately grabbed his enemy by the throat. The brunette was so furious that this little horned bastard dared to harm his mistress that he literally burned with an aura of murder, and the imp, instantly losing his belligerence, begged for mercy. Maldanika herself, still trying to catch her breath, thought with sad irony that only 5 minutes had passed since the garden opened. But just look. They were already about to have a demonic invasion, and sharp ice crystals were lying everywhere. 10 minutes passed, and a puffed-up demon, resembling a boy with dark gray skin, yellow cat eyes, and white hair, sat on a chair, tied up like a mere mortal. As Dominic explained, it was one of the monsters he had fought 1,000 years ago, but he could not understand how this winter moon demon had managed to escape from the sword, since the seal had not actually been removed. And the little devil himself, having regained his former self-confidence, shouted out some orders, tried to force Babelo to bring him tea, so that the time traveler even looked at the horned boy as if he were crazy. The brunette, tiredly rubbing his neck, repeated that he did not know how the boy had gotten out of the blade. One could only assume that he had managed to find a loophole due to the fact that the knight often resorted to magic. In any case, the practical warrior was not going to rack his brains over empty assumptions for long. He made a magical gesture, preparing to repeat the old spell of the seal and again sending the uninvited guest to prison. However, before finishing, the man sternly ordered the little imp to apologize to Babeloa for putting on such an ugly circus. And the little demon grimaced, as if to say, what kind of humiliation was he being subjected to? And the little demon, interestingly enough, actually apologized, or more precisely, said, "Stupid woman, accept my apologies." So much so that the protagonist even wanted to soap his neck. However, she was not about to use her fists just yet, and she did not want Dominic to immediately imprison the demon back. She was very interested in that magic ice. No one had ever been able to create such cold matter that would resist heat, and Mel's eyes burned with greed. And the horned boy, unaware of the impending danger, boastfully declared that as a demon born under the winter full moon, he could create such things in any quantity. Just in case, the time traveler asked the bodyguard if he knew how to do something like that, and the way Dominic quickly looked away, trying to keep his face calm, spoke volumes. At first glance, Maldanika's interest in ice might seem strange, but the inhabitants of the Earth of the 21st century are accustomed to refrigerators and other gifts of civilization, whereas here it was much more difficult. Even the richest people were forced to regularly spend money on buying another batch of ice to store food. But if someone provided them with a source of eternal cold, then this person would be rich. The further development of events was obvious. Smiling very slyly, the newcomer affectionately stroked the little evil spirit on the head and said that she could offer him a job. First of all, she wanted the imp to make crushed ice, used to make sweets, but the demon was horrified. Did this mortal really know about the nightmarish technique of the crushed devil? He couldn't believe that a creature that looked like an angel could know and use such horror. And before Maldanika could melt with pleasure, the imp explained that he hadn't been trying to make a compliment, but rather compared the woman to an executioner. But they still didn't let him explain. Looking at the boy with eyes wide open with greed, Babeloa repeated that he would crush the ice, and even Dominic joined in this mockery. Without any apparent irony, he stated that the protagonist was a very dangerous person because she managed to do something terrible. She tricked him into signing the contract. The little demon almost dropped his jaw to the floor, clearly regretting that he had decided to show himself from the sword at all. But the main character was not happy with such support either. The bodyguard turned the story inside out, making her out to be some kind of villain. And when the impressed little devil screamed in horror that she was such a monster, the newcomer became really sad. She just wanted to live peacefully and work in a small store. Why present her in such a light? And while she remained in frustration, the great hero calmly stated, "We are done, so enjoy your return to the sword, scum." And the horned teenager screamed in horror, begging not to be imprisoned back. In her mind, the protagonist explained that due to the legendary dragon curse, she could not have mana at all, so she could not pose a threat to supernatural beings. But out loud, she only clarified how long the little demon would remain here. Hearing that it would be a maximum of half an hour, the former dugout was genuinely taken aback. Dominic had once trapped the evil spirits. Couldn't he now easily pull out those they might need? As it turned out, no, it can't. The young man spent his entire life learning only how to defeat otherworldly creatures, imprison them in dungeons, and drive them out. And as far as summons and contracts were concerned, he had only the most general knowledge. In other words, harsh and objective reality shattered Maldenika's sweet dreams. She will not see mountains of gold thanks to the living machine for producing endless and eternal ice. Then Babaloa decided to at least find out what other demons were in the sword. And the knight admitted that there were 4 of them, along with the demon of the winter moon. The other 3 were the evil spirits of the autumn mountain, summer star, and spring bloom. And the traveler could not help but make a sarcastic remark about the cuteness of such names. Fearing that something terrible would happen to him, the imp warned that he was the weakest of his brothers, so it would be better for mortals not to even think about causing him serious harm. Otherwise, the revenge of the others would be terrible. The former earthling looked at the white-haired boy with genuine bewilderment and slowly said that she never planned to kill him or anything like that. But the little imp didn't calm down. He shouted at his old enemy and captor to at least look Babilo in the eyes, because she was practically licking her lips, thinking to herself something like, new slave, delicious. Unfortunately, he turned out to be right. Maldenica actually did force him to create a huge amount of ice until his strength completely left his body, and then to crush it. But no one was even going to listen to his complaints. Everyone except the protagonist was busy, and she herself was just chasing her new, so to speak, workers. The little demon was so angry about this that he threatened Dominic, saying, "Just try to let me show myself from the blade again, and you'll get into trouble." In response, the knight only hit the imp on the head with a frying pan, saying that his mouth made too much noise, and even the blonde was a little frightened by such cruelty. But it was only a temporary and idle pity. She still wanted the boy to do a huge amount of other work before his time in the human world was up. And so he ended up giving the protagonist a kind of compliment. She was so ruthless that even a demon lord would have shown her his respect. While the main character was thinking about how she should feel about this, Dominic approached her. He had already made a glass of sweet ice and wanted the hostess to try it. Having barely sniffed it, the girl admitted that the treat was simply delicious, and the imp was delighted. Did this really mean that he would finally be released in peace? Naturally, he was wrong. Instead, Maldenica wanted the demon to continue making even more ice, whole mountains of cold, solid water, so that more of these culinary masterpieces could be produced. Trembling all over, the little demon whispered that even in their native dimension, such disgusting working conditions did not exist, and the heroine graciously decided to give the little one a reward. This was not part of the mockery, as one might think. Babaloa sincerely handed the imp a glass of sweet ice so that he could evaluate the quality of his work for himself. The horned boy turned away sharply in response and pompously declared that he did not need despicable human food. His food was the death and suffering of mortals. But he still decided to try, so that this annoying human girl would finally leave him alone. But, having barely tasted the sweetness, he began to shake again and quietly asked, "Have you brainwashed me?" It's not that the dish turned out disgusting, as the traveler first thought. On the contrary, the delighted little devil declared that this was a real revolution in the very concept of delicious. While Dominic remained indifferent, the protagonist immediately plunged into sweet fantasies. She even imagined how these cups, with funny arms and legs, would make a real revolution. The horned teenager asked for more. but the main character barely had time to hand over the glass before the white-haired imp simply disintegrated into a cloud of blue sparks. As the knight sympathetically explained, half an hour had already passed, and the demon of the winter moon, as promised, was again imprisoned in the sword. But the blonde really didn't want to lose such a profitable worker. She mentally made a vow to bring this character back at all costs and make sure he could no longer escape from work so easily. Several hours passed. The days finally turned to sunset when it became clear that the unknown squire was still sleeping on the second floor, unaware of the drama that had unfolded in his absence. The protagonist had a soft spot for children, but it was time to know better. So she woke the boy up, but offered him a glass of ice for the road. He clearly had little understanding of what was happening around him, but he did not refuse and quickly drained the offered vessel. And the girl looked at this with some anxiety, awaiting the verdict. Naturally, the blonde couldn't judge whether it was tasty or not. He drank too quickly and deeply, causing his throat to spasm from the extreme cold. But when the boy's body got used to the extreme coolness, he opened his eyes wide and stared at the still-filled glass with a completely different look, one of extreme surprise. Like the imp before him, the future knight found the resulting dish incredibly tasty, and the newcomer blossomed with joy when she heard something like this for the second time. Looking at his benefactress, the teenager suddenly declared that his heart was beating very fast. But not from the cold. It was something completely different and incomprehensible. Hastily touching Maldenika's hand, the young squire admitted, somewhat hesitantly, that he seemed to have fallen in love with her. This was the first explanation that came to his mind. Naturally, Babeloa's first reaction to such words and actions was wide-open eyes, a slightly open mouth, and pointing a finger at herself in the style of, "Are you talking about me now, huh?" A few seconds passed, and the protagonist began to laugh so much that she even bent over. But it was clearly a good-natured laugh, and not malicious and sarcastic mirth. A little later, the audience was shown a carriage driving down a street at night. By this point, the skies had already turned an inky shade, and lanterns with candles were burning everywhere. The protagonist led the guest to the carriage by the hand, as if he were her own son or brother. She asked if the boy had enjoyed being a guest today, and he admitted with a happy smile that he had. And Maldenika, with all her altruism, could not help but use such a useful opportunity for a small act of selfishness, and asked the little one to advertise her establishment upon his return. Of course, the teenager agreed without hesitation to tell all his friends and acquaintances that this office was not at all like a disgusting, dilapidated wreck, where wisps of cobwebs fly around like tumbleweeds, and it took a lot of effort for the newcomer to keep a smile on her face. Perhaps she would have even hit an adult for such words, but Babeloa, as mentioned above, had a weakness for teenagers and children, and simply could not stay angry with them for long. The girl helped the first visitor to reach the stopped carriage and warned that her small establishment would officially open in a week. As he climbed inside, the boy warned the heroine that they should all prepare well. In the future, he would definitely visit this stationery store for children again. He was also definitely going to tell his brother about this establishment, and Maldenika grinned to herself. She was very pleased with the potential addition of future clients. But to make sure that the mysterious teenager would not ignore the advertising from his sibling, the blonde gave the young man a bottle of sweet ice so that his brother could also try and appreciate the selection. When he had already left, waving to his benefactors, the main characters waved back, but thought with some weariness that too many things had happened today, and their shop hadn't even opened yet. The girl, to be honest, was even a little scared to think about what adventures would await her modest shop after opening. But Dominic simply extended his hand to the owner and suggested that they go home. The protagonist looked at her protector with a strange smile and then very quietly asked, "Is it true that her letters have already arrived at their destination?" Of course, they were talking about the letter in which Maldenika officially announced her divorce from the Northern Duke. And now she was sincerely interested in how her hated parents reacted to this. Would they finally leave her alone? With a dreamy smile, she took the ancient warrior by the hands, and it was as if invisible flowers bloomed in the air, emitting wonderful aromas, and invisible bells began to ring. Looking straight into the eyes of her loyal comrade, the traveler admitted that she greatly regretted the impossibility of seeing the faces of her relatives. But readers, fortunately, could, because the focus shifted to the Hessman estate. A mustachioed old man in the robes of a secretary or butler knelt before the young lord. He looked worried, and Lennox quickly asked what was wrong. Trying to choose his words very carefully, the servant informed the master that he had just received a letter from his fiancée in which she demanded a divorce. And the brunette, hearing this, stared at the butler as if he had been hit on the head. Memories flashed before the man's eyes, when he, much younger, sat at the bedside and listened to the will of the dying lord, who wanted the heir to marry Maldanika Babeloa. And young Lennox frankly did not like this father's order. He at least partly believed in the dragon's curse, and did not want to tie his fate to its heiress. Coughing desperately, the old man still found the strength to declare that this story was a load of crap. The Kanoa family had never been cursed by a vengeful lizard. Quite the contrary, a powerful immortal being graciously shared its power with the founder of this clan. But since no one knew how to control it, from the outside it looked more like an evil spell. That's why the family members were wasting away like candles for generations. But the main character was a real tough nut to crack. Whoever took her as a wife would become the father of real dragon people. Words cannot describe the enormous prospects this opened up for the lucky supposed father. Because when you can command the most powerful creatures in your home continent, you can easily capture at least it, and at most, the entire world. The elder Hessman dreamed of this more than anything else in the world. But alas, illness took him to the grave before the old man could realize his ambitions, so he passed them on to his son. Thus, Lennox's task was to gain the trust of the future mother of dragons, marry her, and do everything possible so that no one could interfere with this union. But it was even more important to break the will of Maldanika herself, to turn her into a submissive slave for her husband, because the power belonged to her, not to the groom, and she could easily get rid of anyone if she wanted to. The elderly duke wanted to add that if everything worked out, their family would become the most powerful in the entire world, higher than any emperors and kings. But he couldn't. He had already given up the ghost. However, Lennox remembered this order for the rest of his life. So, after a short thought, he respectfully replied, "Okay, father," and covered his parents' eyes with his hand. Naturally, after this, the man would never have let Babeloa live his own life. So he ordered the butler to destroy the letter and continue living as if it had never existed. The old man might have been glad to do something like that, but he couldn't. As it turned out, the prudent Maldanika had added a warning in case the hated groom did that. It was as follows: "Just try to refuse to give me a divorce, and then the entire empire, from the last beggar to the emperor himself, will find out how you had an affair with my half-sister." This was a very serious threat, even for him, but that was not all. The servant was going to dictate the second half, but the brunette irritably snatched the letter from him. In Part 2, Babeloa warned that she had enough compelling evidence to permanently tarnish Gessman's reputation, so he'd better be smart and abandon all his plans. It is unknown what would have happened next. Perhaps the brunette would have gone into a furious rage and destroyed his own living room, but then a little girl came out from the second floor. It was the Duke's younger sister, Marissa. She had exactly the same hair, the color of raven feathers, but her eyes were more of a violet hue. As it turned out, the age difference between the siblings was colossal. The girl was a whole 15 years younger than her older brother, and still continued to play with plush toys. At first glance, she was an ordinary child, like many others. But in reality, she had a shocking secret that would leave anyone speechless. In reality, she was a bastard. The late Gessman Sr. had an affair with an unknown woman from Asia, and from her unknown mother, Marissa inherited a strong character, even excessively firm, perhaps, and also principled. After reading another novel, the little girl announced to everyone that every dirty cheater must die. If Lennox hadn't cared about his younger illegitimate sister, he probably wouldn't have cared. But he did, and he was clearly wary of upsetting her. The man closed his eyes, collecting his thoughts, and then calmly announced to the girl that she had misunderstood everything. There was no romance between him and the blonde. He tried to convince his sister that there was nothing more than friendship with Maldanika. But the little girl was not convinced. She knew perfectly well that this was the most banal phrase from the lips of those who actually climbed into someone else's bed. And now this little girl, who was probably not more than 10 years old, began to scold her older brother in the style of, "Brother, how could you? Cheating is really, really bad." and this began to really irritate the usually cold-blooded Lennox. He endured the first few seconds, but then he couldn't take it anymore and angrily shouted, "I told you I didn't cheat on her!" An awkward and painful silence fell as Marissa simply looked at her older relative, who was rubbing his temples and forehead with his fingers in irritation. In the end, the little brunette quietly declared that Sharia, Maldenika's sister, was a disgusting person and walked back to her room, ignoring the shouts of her older relative. Guessman swore irritably and tiredly and rubbed his head. He clearly felt as if his skull could burst from the inside at any moment, and the faithful butler looked at the young master with an unreadable expression in his eyes. It was difficult to understand whether the old man sympathized with his master or whether deep down he felt real contempt for him, but in any case, he was ready to carry out the order to cancel the divorce. The man tried to assure his subordinate that there would be no problems. Even after everything that had happened, he was not going to just give up and admit defeat. Guessman wanted to fulfill his father's ambitions at any cost and was ready to move mountains for this. But after that, the camera showed the ancestral castle of the Babaloa clan. Most of its inhabitants were already asleep, but not the owners. The fat duke was incredibly furious that his lousy daughter had once again put the family in a bad light, and even dared to put forward some kind of demands. Hildegard, smiling a sly, fox-like grin, nodded in agreement, saying, "Yes, my dear, you are absolutely right. This scoundrel will soon be crawling at our feet again." When his lordship had calmed down and regained the ability to act with a cool head, he finally began to discuss the really important matter. His wife suggested that he not throw thunder and lightning in his reply letter, but simply agree, because that way they would frighten Maldenika even more. Hildegard believed that she would win either way. Either the hated stepdaughter would really leave the clan, as she always wanted, or she would swallow her pride, return, and everything would return to normal. There had never been a case in the Empire where nobles officially renounced their last name. This would definitely create a precedent that would attract the attention of the sovereign himself, but the Duchess did not consider this something bad. The main thing was that the blonde would disappear, giving way to Sharia. Looking at her own reflection in a cup of tea, the woman couldn't help but grin triumphantly. Finally, her efforts had paid off, and she had ruined the girl's life. The Duke, not realizing how easily his second wife was actually manipulating him, began to rage again. Like, this is what this Maldenika deserves. She will become an example for everyone. And Hildegard readily played along, praising her husband for his excellent idea. The current Mrs. Babaloa was a real eminence grise. Remaining behind the scenes most of the time, she made every possible effort to ensure that her own daughter received the best from life. So, the first thing to do is to send His Majesty, the Emperor, a document confirming the protagonist's deprivation of all rights to the title and inheritance, and then send her letters with a response. She whispered all this into her husband's ear, describing how many benefits they could get from such a development of events, and the man listened like a hypnotized rabbit. Some time passed, and the main character, holding the cherished letter with incredible pride, shouted that, "Here it is! It has finally come true! She no longer has any relation to Babaloa." Maldenika was so delighted that she began to dance and spin, completely forgetting about what was happening around her and where she was at all. So much so that even Dominic had to call out to her owner. But even more than propriety, the knight was worried about the absence of a second letter in which Hessman would agree to refuse the wedding. But the blonde assured him that this was not important now. The girl explained that she had pressed Lennox so hard because she didn't know if her family would let her go. But now, having lost her last name, she was a commoner, and that effectively invalidated the marriage in itself. For this, one had to thank the imperial laws that prohibited members of different classes from marrying. And with just one quick, elegant decision, Mel got rid of all her problems. Here, a man in a wizard's robe, who had been in the background doing something all this time, addressed the main characters. He explained that the building was now ready. The result was such that even the usually impenetrable Dominic looked genuinely surprised. Not to mention the former Babaloa, whose mouth was wide open and her eyes wide. And their reaction was understandable, because until recently, the dull, time-darkened building had turned into a real gem, with beautiful, bright walls, a whole roof, and a large window behind which the counter began. When the main characters sat down on the bench, the protagonist began to speak again. Now all they had to do was buy the goods, put them in their places, and then they could open the establishment. If you manage to save up enough money, you can also hire a professional chef who can prepare delicious treats, and this was not the limit of Maldenika's fantasies. She, for example, was going to hire shamans and alchemists, among other things. And even Dominic could not find the words to comment on such a statement. Oh, if they had people with magical talents under their command, then the work would definitely go uphill. The time traveler slept and saw how, thanks to this, her store became the best in the area. Unfortunately, the ancient hero turned out to be a very straightforward person, and therefore honestly said that it was incredibly difficult to find a good magician here, and Mel practically heard her fantasies being shattered. After that, the blonde girl simply turned to the guy and stared at him with an expressionless look, and Dominic raised his eyebrows questioningly in response. In the end, the protagonist mumbled that she herself understood how difficult it was to find a good alchemist or miracle worker here. But the young man continued to drill his interlocutor with a searching gaze. The former Babaloa, with the same optimism in her voice, raised her fist to the sky and swore that she would not give up so easily. She would walk around the earth on foot, turn over forests and mountains, but she would do everything to make her shop the best in the world. After all, Dominic himself was the best proof of this. He is a legendary hero who defeated demons and disappeared 1,000 years ago. But the main character managed to find him, so why can't she do the same with an ordinary normal wizard? The man, turning slightly pink and smiling with the very edges of his lips, admitted that there was some sense in his employer's words. He didn't know that Maldenika had found him thanks to her knowledge from the novel, and not her skills as a bloodhound. Mel, seeing that her bodyguard and now almost friend was supporting her, smiled warmly in response. She hadn't been this happy in a very long time, and she still hadn't lost hope of freeing the Winter Moon Demon to force it to work endlessly on creating ice, or at least learn to summon the imp regularly without breaking the seal on the sword. And then Dominic broke out in a cold sweat when the girl suddenly said that they needed to prepare the candies for tomorrow's opening. That is, instead of a quiet evening's rest, he would have many hours of hard and monotonous work ahead of him. But it was even more unpleasant for the guy to think that the protagonist with the sweetest smile would try to force him to wear a disgusting white apron with frills. Just the thought of this was enough for the knight to cast a sullen glance at the surprised newcomer. As it turned out, Maldenika really did try to put this horror on the bodyguard, and now he warned in a voice as cold as Arctic ice that he would rather die than put on such a, so to speak, uniform. In response, the woman burst out laughing, as if there was a small, naughty child sitting in front of her, who, with the most serious look, was proving that the sky was actually green, and everyone else only thought it was blue. But Mel wisely did not insist and inflate the conflict. Nevertheless, the sweets had to be prepared in any case, and the young man subsequently squatted for a long time, holding a frying pan with the candied mass over the raging flame. Watching this, the former Duchess admitted that she wasn't really sure whether the sweets would be popular with locals, but she liked them herself, so why not? The brunette calmly closed his eyes and said that this was quite enough, thereby demonstrating the trust that he had managed to develop in relation to the main character. In response, the newcomer grinned again, so much so that it seemed the edges of her mouth reached her ears. She was not at all one of those people who were embarrassed by praise or tried to downplay their achievements. Later, while working on the kitchen arrangement, she mentally acknowledged that running a store was not a game and that there were many dangers and difficulties in any business. But she hoped that over time, she would gain many happy memories associated with the store. After this, the action shifted to the Tower of Magic, a majestic castle in which imperial wizards of all sorts and specializations lived, studied, and worked. In one of the offices, a man was kneeling, his gray-haired head bowed low. He was sorrowfully repenting to his interlocutor, claiming that, "It's all my fault." He swore that from now on, he would personally protect the tower, and that something like this would never happen again. But the man in the familiar white shirt and with the characteristic dark skin did not answer yet. The man looked closely at the piece of paper and finally slowly stated that unknown villains had stolen several valuable artifacts from their storage, including a mana box. Despite the seriousness of the situation, he looked as relaxed as possible. even putting his feet up on his expensive desk, and even chided his subordinate for begging for forgiveness on his knees. The young mage, whose name was Ramus, finally raised his head and nervously assured the master that he actually meant that he would soon find the criminals and return what was stolen. Only after this did the dark-skinned brunette take a more formal pose in his chair and look closely at the young man, as if trying to look straight into his soul. And only after that, the author showed the face of the owner of the white shirt and said his name. It was Isaac, and he was not even a high-ranking wizard, but the real owner of the Tower of Magic. Ramus later explained that the circle of suspects, in his opinion, could be reduced to 3 people. The first was the sorceress Countess Ellie, whose magical power, coincidentally, had somehow changed strangely. The second, Duke Lennox Guessman, famous in narrow circles for his magical experiments. As it turned out, he was still talking to the director, and the latter quickly became bored. The brunette would have preferred that his subordinate quickly move on to the last name, rather than play detective. And the last, most likely suspect, turned out to be the protagonist. Maldanika aroused keen interest because she was the last living descendant of the cursed family, and also because she suddenly left the family and opened some strange store. Ramus believed that the former Babeloa was performing some kind of magic in her shop, and it was possible that for such a thing she could be burned at the stake by angry peasants if the truth leaked out. The young wizard's instinct told him that the blonde was most likely the organizer of the crime, so he should focus on her first. But Isaac listened to him with half an ear, thinking about his own. The dark-skinned wizard remembered very well how the main character demonstrated the blade during an argument with her fiancé. And even then, it seemed to him that some strange energy was emanating from the weapon, and if you consider that Mel by nature serves as a conductor for special, pure mana, then the conclusions were promising. Besides, he could not forget the careless rudeness with which the blonde had sent one of the most powerful nobles to distant lands. And all this had aroused in him enough interest to want to take up the matter personally. The amazed Ramus wanted to ask the master certain questions, but very quickly gave up and lowered his head. He never understood Isaac's whims, and began to get used to the fact that his ways, like God's, were inscrutable. And the young magician also admitted in his thoughts that if some woman managed to interest the supreme sorcerer of the empire so much that he decided to personally come to her, then she was clearly an extraordinary person. The young man did not think that this was good, but he did not even suspect what a political storm was about to begin in the near future, because the teenager whom Maldanika had taken in turned out to be the emperor's youngest son. The young prince, almost knocking over servants and expensive furniture on his way, burst into his elder brother's office, and the first prince, a blue-eyed man with silver hair, froze over his desk. The man was clearly very busy, and the younger man's visit caught him at the most inconvenient moment. This was indicated by his sweaty face, his confused look, and the quietly spoken, "Axion?" That was the name of the golden-haired teenager, and he didn't beat around the bush, but went and stunned his relative with the announcement that he had already found his future wife. The emperor's first son didn't answer. He just smiled reflexively, but it would be hard to blame him for that, because it would be rare for a person not to be taken aback by such a statement. And the little prince, sincerely not noticing the shock of the elder, continued to wave his hands in admiration and chatter about how it was love at first sight, a miracle sent by the gods. The platinum blonde was even more surprised when he heard that the prospective bride was actually older than Axion. But if the difference was only a few years, then that was okay. Bringing 10-year-old children together with 15-year-old teenagers was normal practice in the highest circles. The poor man died a little inside again when his little brother carelessly declared that his nameless passion was 10 or even 15 years older. He didn't ask, and when the boy added just as carelessly that Mel was a commoner, his sibling began to get openly angry, because where had anyone ever seen such a thing? A misalliance between an imperial offspring and the rabble. The kid, still not noticing that his brother's smile had become completely unnatural, added with shining eyes that the protagonist had opened a store where she would sell various cool things. The blonde youth realized that he had completely lost touch with the outside world, because when did businessmen even start inviting unfamiliar children to the openings of their enterprises? And then, like an avalanche, a nightmarish guess hit him. What if this mysterious woman was a swindler, trying to profit from a naive child, or even an enemy spy, gaining the trust of a member of the imperial family? However, the man didn't have time to think about this thought properly, because Axion remembered that he had prepared a birthday present for him. And then soft music began to play quietly in the room. The eldest heir looked at the antique wooden box in his hands in surprise, before dispassionately noting that it was a nice gift, but the boy enthusiastically asked if his sibling was truly happy. He turned pink and opened his mouth when the first prince calmly replied that he, of course, liked the gift. He would have been happy with any item from the hands of the younger one. Then Axion waved his hands enthusiastically, remembering that Mel had told him the same thing, which meant that she really was very smart. But the emperor's first son almost cursed when he heard about this woman again. Then the blonde handed his brother a jar of sweet ice, and the young man once again felt that the universe was going crazy, since when could commoners afford expensive ice? From one minute to the next, this case became more and more suspicious and simply downright strange, as if the princes had found themselves inside a poorly written tabloid detective story. On the other hand, Axion stared at his older brother with the look of a happy little dog. You had to have a heart of stone to intentionally upset such a little one. He couldn't wait to see his relative finally try the offered treat and say how it tasted. Wasn't it wonderful? The silver-haired boy did try it anyway, and although he didn't say anything, the little prince knew perfectly well that his brother also liked it very much. The first heir hastened to cover his face with his hand so that the boy would not see how his lips stretched into a grin of their own accord. The lemonade really did turn out to be tasty. On the other hand, it was a very convenient excuse to try to meet with the mysterious businesswoman, and Axion, of course, did not refuse help. And then the young blonde smiled, as if a miniature sun had risen in the room, and added that the protagonist's cherished dream was to make all the children in the world happy. The man only stroked his head, but to himself he noted this interesting fact, that the main character wants to start a business with an audience in the form of children. Of course, if you trust the child's words, then this mysterious Mel was the most wonderful person in the world, very kind and sincere, from whom, in principle, no danger should be expected. He clearly doubted this, but he did not have time to develop this thought. The respectful voice of the secretary warned His Majesty that Duke Hessman had arrived from the northern lands. As it turned out, Axion didn't like Lennox either, grumblingly calling him that scary duke. And when his brother explained that they had some common cause, he snorted contemptuously. He didn't even want to be in the same room with the brunette, so he resolutely went on about his business, and the first prince only waved goodbye to his little brother with a smile. Then the blonde youth with a serious face noted that his sibling was extremely capricious when it came to his social circle. He didn't like something about Gessman, and since then he avoided this nobleman like the plague. This also meant that Mel was an incredibly charming person to have managed to make Axion fall in love with her. But after that, the plot focused entirely on the meeting of the two characters. Lennox greeted the crown prince respectfully, finally naming his name, Casion, and noted that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. And the platinum blonde agreed with this with an ambiguous smile, for he thought that the protagonist was not really a saint, but simply a hardened deceiver. From the subsequent conversation, it became clear that the Northern Duke had put together a large-scale business project aimed primarily at children, teenagers, and the elderly. Naturally, such a cunning and prudent man prepared a test sample to demonstrate to the sponsors, and Cassian even slightly opened his mouth in surprise. It turned out that the mysterious artifact was a bottle of perfume and a fountain pen, in beautiful gilded cases, sparkling with cleanliness, but overall completely ordinary. Gessman calmly noted that the design itself would be a breakthrough, but it was only one of the many advantages of the future product. The same pen, for example, had length measurements all over its surface. However, the gray-haired crown prince did not fall for Lennox's charm. Carefully taking the pen and twirling it between his fingers, the man noted that this thing would probably be inconvenient for children. Then the Duke, looking the prince straight in the eye, calmly asked, what business did it have on them whether the goods were convenient and useful for the users? Their goal should be to make money, nothing more. And children and teenagers are the most convenient targets, since they always strive to imitate their elders in everything, so the profit of the business is guaranteed. But Cassian still doubted. Then the brunette added, with an unusually sly grin, that he didn't really care about the kids, since their parents were the true targets of the business. As Guessman himself put it, they are the most loyal clients to our association. And at that moment, the brunette resembled not so much a man as a cunning, hungry fox. Then Lennox added that he was going to start a business with the Babaloa clan, and the prince immediately understood which way the wind was blowing. The Duke had already launched seemingly unprofitable projects many times in the past, spending huge amounts of money on advertising all sorts of crap and giving it away almost for free. But in fact, this was a well-calculated tactic not even of a shark, but of a business piranha, because thoughtless people, stupefied by advertising, bought consumer goods from Guessman's company in droves, ignoring all other publishers and driving the poor guys to ruin. One could feel whatever one wanted about the Grand Duke, but even His Highness could not help but admit that this was, although a brilliant business strategy. After thinking about it for a while, Cassian decided to carefully ask the question that was particularly troubling him. What kind of relationship does the brunette have with Mrs. Sharia Babaloa? When will it come to the wedding ceremony? Lennox calmly and briefly replied that he would only marry her older sister, Maldenica. And the prince gave him a look in the style of, "Are you really taking me for a fool now?" After a moment's pause, the platinum blonde declared that in that case, Hessman would be better off staying away from the Duke's younger daughter, because after all, the eldest should be his legal wife. As it turned out, the prince had heard scandalous rumors about the potential breakup of the aristocrat with his legal bride, so he advised him to give up these games and not tarnish the reputation of both women. Lennox lowered his eyes meekly and admitted that Maldenica had begun to behave very strangely, to the point that unpleasant gossip had already begun to spread among the people. In response, Cassian tiredly put his fingers to his face and simply asked, if Guessman so stubbornly wanted to marry the blonde and not her sister, then why doesn't he act like a gentleman and protect the dignity of his woman? Ultimately, you don't need to throw your clothes into puddles so that a lady can cross without getting dirty. Basic good and respectful behavior has not been cancelled. Hessman stared at the imperial heir with a face as if he suddenly and very strongly wanted to go to the toilet. But his upbringing and the importance of the situation did not allow him to ask for permission. In the end, the brunette very politely, but coldly noted that it was none of Cassian's business what kind of relationship reigned between the groom and the bride, not to mention the fact that Lennox was still very merciful to the elder Babaloa after what she had done. After a brief pause, the prince politely replied that the crown could not afford to finance the proposed project, and Lennox, in an even more respectful but icy tone, expressed his regret about this. The fair-haired youth noted that Hessman's stores practically ruled the streets of the capital. Almost all businesses go to the Duke in one way or another, and this stifled all other small businesses. In response, the black-haired man only asked with slight contempt why it mattered to him. After all, if you think about it, he even honored such losers by making them slaves of his clan and not just bankrupt on the ashes. Then the aristocrat began to read a speech on the topic of how it was simply the law of the jungle, the strong devouring the weak and all that, and Cassian listened to it with the impartiality of a stone Buddha. Before his eyes appeared the image of his younger brother, who just recently, with a happy gleam in his eyes, claimed that the mysterious Mel sincerely wanted to make the children happy and not just profit off of them. The older brother just pressed his palm to his face and quietly said, "Ha!" And it didn't take a medium to understand how strong the emotions were raging in his soul right now. When Guessman had already left the office, Cassian quietly admitted that it was better to be such an idealist. Even he felt sick of the brunette's cynical and heartless approach to business and those around him. After that, the action shifted back to the main character, and she was not doing very well. To be honest, no one even noticed the opening of the store due to the lack of advertising. She was clearly upset, although she tried her best to hide it. But Dominic at least tried to console his employer, reminding her that classes at the academy were not over yet. The man looked noticeably worse than usual, with huge dark bags under his eyes, even paler skin and a tired, detached expression on his face, all because of a night full of work. The knight advised Maldenica to focus on coming up with new interesting products, and this immediately changed the girl's mood. She already had a bunch of ideas, each one cooler than the other, And the first thing the blonde was going to try was beer candies. And Dominic's jaw almost dropped in surprise, because he couldn't even understand what it was. With a conspiratorial air, the former Babaloa explained that in reality, almost all children strive to be like adults. And since adults drink very often, the younger generation also secretly takes a swig from the bottle. This was, of course, very bad. But the girl knew how to make money from it. She planned to make 2 types of candy, one of which would be made from real alcohol, and the other would only resemble it in taste. And so the first would be sold to adults, and the second to children. True, in order for the food to be of high quality, you will have to hire wizards, and you will have to try to find and persuade them, and the budget is not unlimited. In general, it is a continuous expense, and the business has just started. Dominic remained silent for a while, clearly digesting such volumes of information that were unfamiliar to him, but in the end, he calmly replied that he could handle such things himself. Maldenica's eyes sparkled with delight, but the brunette immediately brought her back down to earth. In any case, they needed a lot of expensive ingredients, primarily beer. And then the young man also admitted that he actually does not possess the spells that allow him to change alcohol. He will learn them very quickly, but he still needs a teacher who would explain and show everything in detail. As Dominic had mentioned in the past, he was only a master of demon-fighting spells, and in everything else, he was still a clueless student. So, it would be even better for them to work with a specific recipe. This did not destroy the protagonist's enthusiasm, but on the contrary, fueled it even more. Now she was properly motivated to sell the things they already had and get an increase in the budget. However, it is always much easier to say than to put into practice. Until now, only the wind had been blowing in their store, driving a few fallen leaves in front of it. After a long and awkward pause, the protagonist said that since there were no underage buyers on the horizon yet, why not take advantage of this to get to know the neighboring merchants? And then the audience was shown a still unknown girl who was working on an empty barrel. Sweat was running down her face from fatigue, and there was a huge dark bruise on it. Naturally, it was with her that the main character decided to make the acquaintance first, approaching with a friendly smile and offering a large lollipop as a gift. The woman with the black eye was very surprised when she found out that Mel owned a shop next to the academy. After all, there had always been useless ruins in that place. But of course, she didn't refuse the gift. The girl carefully brought the treat to her mouth, took a timid, quick sample, and couldn't hold back a sigh of admiration. The taste was good enough that the stranger instantly warmed up and declared that the blonde's shop must be incredibly cool to make things like that. Then the time traveler again began to explain the basics of her business. And again, things went with difficulty, because the local resident could not understand what was being discussed. At some point, the woman asked a strange question about whether everything was okay with the protagonist. And Maldenica was even taken aback. Such an ordinary phrase sounded so suddenly and unusually out of context. The girl opened her mouth, but then remembered something and very awkwardly avoided answering, saying that everything was fine. There was nothing strange. And this only made the former Babaloa even more wary. It is unknown what this awkward conversation would have ultimately led to, but then the strange woman finally decided to introduce herself. As it turned out, her name was Lily. She worked in an establishment with a simple name, Lessa's Tavern. But for some reason, it made the main character freeze, no worse than a clap of thunder overhead. The worker explained that this place was located next to the same academy, but they had gone too far from it, and it was as if a switch had been flicked in the blonde's head. It was a real gift of fate. She had just thought about where she could find a supplier of alcohol for making sweets, and then suddenly such luck. So Mel immediately asked Lily to introduce her to the employer. The protagonist's face turned completely pink, and her already bright green eyes became even brighter and shinier, like a pair of emeralds. And that's not to mention her happy smile. The brunette with the bruise was very confused. On the one hand, she clearly didn't want to drag a stranger from the street to her workplace. But on the other hand, how could she resist such a little son? Then the readers were shown how Maldenica sat with a bored look, propping her head up with her hands, because it turned out that the tavern owner had fallen ill and was absent. But almost immediately after this, Lily sympathetically added that it would be better for the protagonist to come tomorrow, closer to lunchtime. The lady promised to appear just at that moment, And now, Mel was bored out of her mind in her own little shop before she noticed Dominic and decided to share with him the good news about the tavern nearby. The man was generally glad to know that the solution to the beer candy production had been found so quickly, and that was why he couldn't figure out why the blonde was frowning so much. As it turned out, the newcomer was not blind at all and clearly noticed both Lily's anxiety and discomfort, as well as her huge bruise under her left eye. And all of this led to very bad thoughts. Whatever Lessa's tavern was hiding, it was clear that something very bad was going on there. And now, Maldenite clearly wanted to figure out what exactly, and not just make a deal. After this, the action immediately moves to the next day, when the protagonist has already talked to Lessa herself, who turned out to be a pale and dejected middle-aged woman. She generally appreciated the idea, but was not going to help, because she planned to close the tavern. The main character asked with sincere surprise and even fear why this was so, and the faithful Dominic watched the conversation with an icy face, carefully remembering every word. In response, a completely different voice said that the reason was some racketeers, and the former Babeloa turned around sharply, even more frightened by the unpleasant turn of the conversation. The voice, as it turned out, belonged to Lily. Now she didn't even try to pretend to be cordial and optimistic, and looked very much like a wet, beaten sparrow. The reason turned out to be a gang that was in charge in the area, nicknamed the Red Pirates. These thugs demanded huge amounts of money from all the shops and taverns in the area, and beat up customers as punishment for underpayment. The corrupt guards did nothing to stop these scoundrels, who were rumored to be sponsored by some aristocrat. And since the bandits also possessed magic, the common burghers had no chance of dealing with them. For protection, they demanded no less than 5 million from their own tavern. An absolutely enormous sum, even for Maldenika, who was accustomed to luxury, so Lessa gave in. And the criminals were supposed to show up for the tribute any minute. But Lily didn't even have time to finish saying this when the door shook from the noise, and a rough voice demanded to let them in. The worker was frozen with horror, and her mistress rushed to the protagonist, begging her to hide quickly before all these villains burst in and did something terrible to the noble lady. Lessa took Maldenika and her companion to another room and assured them that everything would be fine. The tavern was closed. There shouldn't be any confusion. The main thing was that the guests themselves remained as quiet as a mouse. Of course, Dominic, being a legendary warrior, was not afraid of any bandits and wanted to fight them, but the innkeeper forbade him to even think about such an option. The Red Pirates would go completely berserk if they suddenly found out that one of their victims had let strangers in, and this was said so heatedly that the main characters did not have the courage to argue. For several minutes, the blonde and the brunette sat obediently in the room until a strange and terrible noise began outside. Just loud swearing quickly turned into screams, and then the sound of things being broken was heard. As it turned out, some thug attacked Lily and started beating her up. And this angered Maldenika to such an extent that she instantly forgot all her orders and hit the thug on the head. It seemed as if the world itself had come to a pause. Everyone present froze. The worker stared at the protagonist in horror, and the thug who had been hit very slowly rubbed his neck and began to get to his feet. But the main character not only wasn't scared, but even said with cold contempt, "Get up, freak, and turn around. I'll at least look at your disgusting face." The huge red-haired man, still kneeling on one knee and with his face down, laughed in response. After all, no one had been able to beat him like that for 4 years. And then he, without any false joy or friendliness, growled, "Who does Maldenika think she is? And does she even know who she just dared to raise her hand against?" From the outside, the newcomer still seemed like an ice statue, absolutely unshakable and fearless. But in reality, she was scared to the point of shaking in her knees. Mel just hit it well. And Dominic, still sitting in the room, also made telepathic contact with her. He warned that he would lend his mistress some of his power for a while, and then the magic began. Now the protagonist could see and react much faster than mere mortals, and her body became harder and stronger than steel. And this gift could not have come at a better time, because the leader of the bandits had already grabbed the blonde by the neck. With his eye twitching with rage, the bandit threatened that if Maldenika dared to go against them again, they would break her neck. But the girl did not feel even the slightest pressure from his grip. Realizing this, the newcomer simply moved her hand a little, and brought down the huge, muscular man with such casual ease, as if he were actually lighter than the softest feather. The other red pirates looked at this with horror, and it was even easy to understand them. The girl easily defeated one of them, being 3 times lighter and a head shorter. And now, when the balance of power had changed dramatically, the former Earthling was not going to give these scoundrels mercy. She, of course, would not have done it before. But now, when she was a little drunk from Dominic's superhuman power, she was even less going to. She was all alone against at least 5 men. But now these seasoned thugs resembled a pack of frightened rabbits suddenly confronted by a hungry wolf. All these bandits were very scared, until one of them decided to take a step forward. He was even bigger and stronger than the red-haired bone-breaker that Maldenica had knocked over, and he did not consider her a threat. The huge pirate boastfully called the protagonist an idiot, one of those stupid women on whom his comrades feast and make money. And the other bone-breakers nodded awkwardly in agreement. If the main character had been in her normal state, she would most likely have been very scared. But now she felt like an invulnerable goddess. And so, with a mocking grin, she beckoned the thug with her finger and offered to come out. The further development of events was predictable to the point of toothache. The blonde threw the men around with casual jabs and kicks until one of them tried to pounce from behind. But this attack also had no effect. Maldenica easily anticipated it, intercepted the opponent's hands, and then forcefully slammed him back into the ground. In short, when the dust settled, only the main character remained on her feet, completely unharmed, not sweating, and continuing to crack jokes about her defeated enemies. Several of the people who remained conscious wheezed angrily, asking why this had happened. Where did some girl get such strength from? And they realized too late that they had attracted her attention. No, the former Duchess had no intention of continuing to beat up these bastards. She had something worse planned, namely, to take all the money and jewelry that they had lying around. This horrified the bandits, but whole bones and organs that had not been crushed into mush were more valuable to them than coins. So after a few minutes, the protagonist was happily clutching whole bags of gold and silver to her chest. She was so happy that she screamed out loud about how much she could now do with her store, and the beaten racketeers, not knowing the context, were finally convinced that they had gotten involved with a madwoman. Unfortunately for them, Maldenica heard this insult and was clearly prepared to take the matter to its logical conclusion, after which there would not be a wet spot left of the bandits. Realizing this, the red pirates instantly forgot about their pride and began to beg for forgiveness. But Mel very quickly had no time for them. As it turned out, Lily ran out of the tavern during the commotion and gathered a crowd of defenders. The situation that arose was more than awkward. People obviously wanted to help, since they even managed to overcome their fear of the gang. But in the end, they came to the very end, when everything had been resolved safely anyway. Now, this whole crowd looked at the blonde with an adoring gaze, and the newcomer felt cold sweat running down her back. She was ready to show off as much as she wanted in front of her defeated opponents, but not in front of the audience. The townspeople showered the ex-duchess with enthusiastic comments, and she herself increasingly felt the need to run away somewhere to the ends of the earth, dig a very deep hole there, and never climb out of it. The innkeeper, Lessa, also managed to twist the knife in the wound, joining the crowd and telling that Mel behaved like a hero from a fairy tale, suddenly appeared at the most difficult moment and fixed everything. Eventually, people started shouting, "Hip hip, hooray!" in honor of the unknown strongwoman who single-handedly defeated all those terrible red pirates, freeing the innocent shopkeepers from their yoke. No one noticed at what moment Dominic left the tavern. He simply very quietly approached Maldenica from behind, threw his black cloak over her shoulders, and congratulated her on a job well done. But the woman, to put it mildly, didn't care about this. She wanted to do a good deed, not without it, but so that now she would be honored and people would rush to carry her in their arms. And then, as if from under the ground, a journalist appeared and began to shower the blonde with questions. So the newly minted heroine decided to retreat, citing sudden fatigue. But then she took a closer look at her interlocutor, recognized his distinctive outfit, glasses, and notebook with notes, and felt as if a switch had been clicked in her head. Naturally, she simply could not miss such a great opportunity. And now Maldenica pressed the dumbfounded man, begging him to advertise her stationery store. The words flowed from her mouth like raindrops from a cloud. She was in a hurry to tell all the possible advantages of her establishment, and the writer did not have time to write down or even understand what was said. When the conversation turned to iced drinks, the journalist noted with a muffled expression that they must be exorbitantly priced. But Mel replied with a smile that this was nonsense. Any child could afford it, and the newspaper employee would be treated to it for free. Then she remembered less and decided to remind him of her offer. Okay, before the woman couldn't continue working because of the bandits. But now nothing should stop her, right? Perhaps before the woman would have refused anyway, not wanting to take risks with a shady stranger. But now the elderly innkeeper simply silently looked at the outstretched hand and began to cry. Those around watched this with respectful silence, as if it were a great and sacred event, while the tavern owner said only a few short words. "I will help as much as I can." Then, however, the onlookers began to whisper about how much blood the red pirates had managed to drink from them. It would seem to be a decent area, and an academy for noble children is very close. But no, not a single lousy guard wanted to dirty his hands, even for bribes. As for the journalist, it suddenly became clear that he was not really a professional. It was Maldanika, with her heroism, that inspired the guy to pick up a pen and a notebook, and now he was ready to make every effort to immortalize this feat. Some time passed, and the action returned to the main character's store. And there she, together with Dominic, gazed in silent shock at the resulting beer candy, the size of a good-sized rock. Trying not to burst into hysterical sobs or laughter, the girl asked the assistant where they had made a mistake, but the knight objected that he had done everything correctly. After all, the young man had been trapped in his own sword for 1,000 years, like a disembodied spirit, unable to influence the world around him in any way. Naturally, he had lost the subtlety of control over his abilities and would be restoring it for at least several more months. Mel may have known in her head that Dominic was absolutely right, but her verdict was disappointing. A huge, creepy beer candy is not cool at all. So, awkwardly rubbing her neck, she suggested that in the future she cook for herself, and the young brunette replied in a very serious voice that his employer would definitely do better. Yes, it was not sarcasm, as one might have supposed. The spells associated with the transformation of food were very simple, so the knight believed that Maldanika would be able to master them easily and quickly. It was a good option, but there was one small snag. The main character considered herself a descendant of a cursed family whose members were physically incapable of any magic. The ancient warrior was very surprised by this, because he had been imprisoned many centuries before the legend of the dragon's curse appeared. And Mel, with even greater awkwardness, admitted that as a child, she had taken an academic test for magical abilities and failed it miserably. In fact, the protagonist was being a little disingenuous. The earthly girl, of course, could not try to enter the local wizarding school, but she remembered very well how the real Maldanika Babeloa tried to do it. Naturally, she failed miserably, and the author, to add insult to injury, arranged everything so that Sharia entered the same academy with ease, due to her incredible magical gift. Dominic didn't know all these details yet, and he couldn't believe that such a thing was possible in principle. From his point of view, it was almost the same as meeting a person who couldn't breathe. And a second later, it turned out that the guy had even more compelling reasons to doubt the existence of the curse, because if Mel was a complete mediocrity, then he would not be able to lend her his power. It would be like trying to shout to the deaf. Hearing this, the newcomer could only widen her eyes and open her mouth in shock. But, having thought about what was said, she admitted that there was some reason in the bodyguard's words. The ancient hero, meanwhile, interpreted the hostess's confusion in his own way. Considering that the blonde could not take his word for it, the young man decided to move on to practice. A ball of white light appeared in the warrior's hand, like a shooting star, as children often depict it. He asked if Mel could see it, and she hummed. Then the man added that the yellow light meant that the viewer had mana, but the protagonist was surprised, because she saw the ball of light as Snow White. This surprised the guy even more, so much so that for a few seconds he simply lost the power of speech. And when he returned it, he declared that a source of pure mana was hidden in Maldanika's body. The night sorcerer launched into a long explanation. Each wizard in this setting has a certain specialization, like elemental magic or something else, but the source of energy is always mana, born in the heart of the user. However, the so-called pure mana was an energy of a completely different kind. In fact, it was the transformed life force of the user, and this caused shock to the newcomer. No, not because she was even theoretically capable of witchcraft, but because once she used up her mana, she would simply die. And even Dominic didn't know if that was true, because he had never heard of such people becoming wizards before. After thinking for a bit, the young man added as a consolation that nothing would stop the former Babelua from becoming a good alchemist. And the woman even covered her mouth with her hands in delight. She could now live with the thought that she was not a damned degenerate, a freak with a disability, just an anomaly from which, with due diligence, a wonderful master of potions would emerge. Then she remembered how, in the original novel, Lennox had suddenly become a great alchemist himself, becoming even richer and more famous than before. And the thought that he, too, might have pure mana gave the protagonist heartburn. Dominic, meanwhile, continued to explain. Alchemists may not be able to shoot lightning from their fingers, but they can create precious metals from thin air, including gold. The blonde immediately asked what her specialization was in this area, and the man politely but coldly explained that he had no idea. Maldeneka herself had thought 3 minutes ago that she was a complete zero in magic. Then he added that perhaps some good would come of the traveler, but only on condition that she had enough magical power, and every word of his fell on the poor heroine like a stone. Rubbing her neck in irritation, the protagonist asked again whether she had this damn mania or not, and the young man confirmed that she did, and that this energy was only getting bigger. She still dreamed of summoning the winter moon demon, but Dominic's verdict was harsh and humiliating. The woman's current abilities would be enough for the imp to stay in the human world for a maximum of 3 seconds. Maldenic collapsed to the ground in despair, and the knight, having softened a little, explained that alchemists were able to replenish their mana reserves on their own, although he had no idea how. And the traveler, frankly speaking, didn't know this herself. There were very few alchemist characters in the novel, and the only one who achieved mastery was Isaac, the head of the magic tower. And the protagonist had no idea how to approach him now. He had no connection with the real Babeloa, and the Earthling wasn't even sure if the sorcerer was still alive, because in the original source, he once simply disappeared without a trace after an unsuccessful attempt on Lennox, the author's favorite. Finally, the blonde didn't know how the wizard's tower was arranged, and whether it was possible to somehow gain access to it, so the solution was obvious. She had to ask her loyal protector for help. Looking him firmly in the eyes, Maldenika promised that she would do her best to become the best potion maker on the continent, and Dominic allowed himself a very slight, but still a smile. Shyly looking away, the man admitted out loud that he sincerely believed in his partner and would always believe, and as a first experience, he was ready to offer to try to make some kind of miracle sword. When the blonde, without really hearing the last sentence, decided to make as many beer candies as possible, the warrior felt himself falling into a stupor, and his jaw was reaching for the floor. With a face as dull as a dead fish, he asked if Maldenika wanted to create even more nightmares, like the one that was now propping up their ceiling, and the heroine, not catching the sarcasm, agreed. The protagonist had already entered her fantasy mode, from which even a very strong kick could not bring her out. Before her eyes appeared endless rows of various sweets, of all sizes and shapes. When she tearfully asked her bodyguard to imagine a lollipop in the shape of a cutlet, the knight couldn't resist asking if Mel cared about anything in this life other than damn food. After thinking for a bit, the woman added that she also wanted to summon a small demon to endlessly make ice for her. And the ancient hero had no comments other than an indistinct, "I understand." A little more time passed, and readers were shown the first sample, a whole tray of magnificent treats that shimmered in the light, reminiscent of beer mugs. Unfortunately, Maldenika was so tired that she didn't even have the strength to enjoy her result, and Dominic, not at all out of breath, noted that the hostess had reached her limit. In about a day, her supply will be restored naturally. There is no need to worry about this. So the guy took one of the candies and put it in his mouth. A few seconds later, the brunette noted that the sweet had a very unusual taste, and the girl jumped up as if stung, asking, why did the assistant say this in such an unusual voice? As it turned out, while the girl was suffering, trying to achieve excellent results, and recovering from wild fatigue, the guy decided to play a little prank, influencing the cookie he had eaten with magic. After a pause, both protagonists started laughing. After all, Dominic was over 1,000 years old, and yet he still acted like a teenager and fell for his own joke with a change in voice. Then something truly strange happened. It was as if an invisible stopwatch began to tick away the moments with a loud tick, causing the main characters to freeze. When the third second was up, they both realized what a treasure they had accidentally created. Children would sell their souls just to get access to these luxurious candies that make the eaters speak in someone else's voice. The protagonist ran to Lessa to share the wonderful new thing with her, and the audience was then shown Isaac, who finally decided to go on reconnaissance, but was followed by an overly enthusiastic wizard in the form of a child. Rasmus had to be thanked for this. He had gotten it into his head that if he let his beloved boss go on such a dangerous mission alone, then some kind of nightmare would certainly happen to the brunette. But, on the other hand, looking at the young wizard in glasses, whose name was Henry, the Archmage admitted that a walk in his company was far from the worst way to spend an evening. The man leaned over to the little boy like a kind uncle and kindly asked if it was cool to walk outside the tower, and the boy enthusiastically agreed. As it turned out, Henry was actually a child, not an adult in disguise, and Isaac had taken him along with him in the hopes that Maldenica would be more accommodating due to her love for children. In addition, he believed that a person's true nature was best illustrated by their behavior around a lonely toddler when they thought no one was watching them. So the Supreme Warlock asked Henry to approach the blonde for a conversation. This child with glasses, by the way, was also special. He was only 5 years old and learned to speak late, but was a real genius in the magical arts. And this, unfortunately, had a downside. Many people have already suffered when they decided to laugh at a harmless fool, not suspecting that he was one of the best magicians of his generation. Now he asked his mentor to help him finish their secret spy mission later because he didn't know how to do it on his own. But he was immediately distracted when he noticed Babaloa approaching. The man reminded them that they only needed to talk to Mel, but Henry objected that Sir Rasmus had ordered them to thoroughly examine the blonde, which was a completely different matter. Not a single muscle moved on the Archmage and Alchemist's face, but he winced mentally. He really wasn't planning on playing any spy games. He just wanted to look at Maldenica up close to dispel the boredom that was tormenting him. In fact, he was initially only interested in whether the former Duchess always behaved like a mad dog, ready to pounce on any opponent, no matter how much more powerful he was. But that was only at the very beginning. Now the brunette sincerely wanted to study the structure of the girl's body because her mana lines looked very unusual, not resembling anything he knew. The protagonist was walking down the street at that very moment, and as soon as Henry approached her, she melted like a piece of butter on a hot frying pan, like a fanatical cat lover at the sight of a kitten. While the little wizard greeted her, unobtrusively starting a conversation, Isaac carefully watched the main character's reaction and eventually thought, what kind of bad thing did Guessman have to do to deserve treatment from a person like Mel? And while the former Duchess blushed and melted from incredible emotion, the young magician mentally gloated. How easy it was to subjugate her. He didn't even have to make an effort. The baby asked his sister out loud to play with him, but in reality, he just needed to touch her in order to be able to scan the mana lines of his interlocutor. If it had been an adult man or woman in his place, the protagonist would have long ago suspected something was wrong, but she simply lost her mind as soon as she started talking about children. She herself took the hand of her young interlocutor and added in a friendly manner that little Henry must love to study, and the bespectacled wizard almost fainted from such words. The boy recoiled in horror, not understanding how the guinea pig could have found out such a thing, and the girl kindly explained that there were calluses on his small, delicate hands, and so the roles changed imperceptibly. Now it was no longer the young sorcerer who felt himself to be the superior party, but Maldenica, without realizing it, terrified him. And the author's footnote helpfully explained that the protagonist was prepared for almost anything. Her truly bottomless bags contain things for any occasion. After rummaging around in it for a minute, the woman pulled out what would best suit little Henry, a beautiful, well-made pencil case, and even with an inscription in the language of the Forerunners. To an ignorant person, this sentence would mean nothing. It would seem like just scribbles. But the learned child immediately translated to himself the beautiful inscription, "The truth will always set you free." As it turned out, this was something like a motto of the wizards of the tower, and this was enough for the boy to begin to treat the main character as a saint, and not a dangerous stranger. And when the blonde also offered Henry to accept pencils from her, he almost lost consciousness. After all, the sages of the past wrote their great treatises with them, when no one could even think about pens, and that's what he does himself. Because of this, the young sorcerer finally became convinced that Maldanika had somehow found out who he really was. But in reality, of course, the protagonist did not know this. And when he asked how the former Babaloa could know so much about him, the girl with a sinister grin answered that it was the secret of her special ability. Leaning down very close to Henry's ear, Mel explained in a whisper that she knew what children dreamed about, and this revelation made the bespectacled boy mentally scream in horror. An adult wizard, or even an ordinary person, would not have been impressed at all, but the bespectacled man, with all his witchcraft skills, remained a 5-year-old boy. And from his point of view, this was truly creepy. Now he was sure that the main character was in fact a deadly monster, a nightmarish seducer, and as long as she was alive, every child in the world was in great danger. He was already mentally praying, calling for Mr. Isaac to come to his aid, when someone's voice shouted "Henry" from afar, forcing both characters to turn towards the sound. Naturally, it was the Archmage who decided to stop his observation and finally come out on stage, and the boy instantly appeared next to him, seeking protection from this nightmarish Babaloa. With his sculpted, muscular frame, cocoa-skinned skin, piquant moles, and black, carelessly tousled hair, the High Mage looked stunning, so much so that Maldanika was speechless. And when she finally spoke, it was time for Isaac to freeze with his mouth open. Because of all the possible things, the woman could not think of anything better than to declare, "Henry, is this really your father?" The man and the boy were indeed completely different from each other, so it was impossible to mistake them for close relatives, and the master alchemist declared that he was only a guardian. Mel, however, still did not attach much importance to this, and added that she wanted to give Henry this small, cute kicker, and the Archmage responded to this with polite gratitude. Isaac most likely decided that they could part ways at this point, but he knew the newcomer too little. She simply couldn't resist the opportunity to offer someone to try her first food. For a few seconds, the Supreme Mage looked at his interlocutor very intently and appraisingly, and then carefully touched her hand, in which the child's pencil case was still clutched. The blonde was taken aback, and when she came to her senses, she pulled her hand back in horror and stepped back, clearly intending to ask what the hell the stranger was doing. But Isaac continued to smile with all possible politeness, as if nothing strange had actually happened, and he noted to himself how unusual Maldanika's gift was. For him, the protagonist's mana lines were like a dying fire. Some embers still sparkled in it. There were tiny sparks, but it was enough to blow hard enough to extinguish them completely, and this was very strange, because Babaloa did not look like she was dying. And while the woman was examining herself, as if trying to find some kind of mark, the brunette made the correct assumption that this anomaly was connected with the heritage of Kanoa. However, even this sorcerer was surprised when the main character suddenly began to advertise her shop and lure people into it, promising a bunch of other sweets, as if nothing strange had happened between them. And while the sorcerer blinked his coal-black eyes in confusion, the blonde hurried on about her business, not forgetting to say goodbye to Henry and his pseudo-father, of course. The wizards were too surprised to respond to this in any way. They stood for a long time afterwards and watched the quickly retreating figure with golden curls. The first to come to his senses, oddly enough, was the boy. Carefully tugging at the hem of his mentor's clothes, he asked why Mel so stubbornly called them father and son. For the first few moments, the man simply looked at the baby. Then he grinned slyly, clasped his hands on his chest, and declared that the girl was not mistaken, which caused Henry to quietly, shockedly say, "What? No, of course he didn't mean that the boy was his biological son or anything like that." But, on the other hand, it was Isaac who picked him up and is now raising and teaching him. Therefore, from the Archmage's point of view, he could well be called a parent for the bespectacled man. And he said this without a hint of irony, even taking the child in his arms as if he were his own. Henry had no words to comment on this, but judging by his flushed cheeks, The words of the leader of the Magic Tower really sank into his soul. When the young genius of the magical arts decided to speak, his first question was, "If you are my father, then who is my mother?" But Isaac, with an embarrassed laugh, admitted that he did not know, because he had not thought about such a thing. That's how they returned to their native tower, like real father and son. And they didn't even realize that this was only the beginning of their long and complicated relationship with Maldanika. After some time, the protagonist returned to her store. Dominic was reading something at that moment, so he only briefly asked whether the girl had been able to carry out her plan. Naturally, everything went as well as possible. After that story with the Red Pirates, those around her would have accepted even downright trash from the hands of the former Duchess without hesitation, not to mention rather tasty candies. The young knight praised his friend for her success and added promisingly that he also had good news. So Maldanika immediately pricked up her ears, ready to listen. As it turned out, while the main character was walking around the city and offering people candy to try, a journalist dropped into her shop, looking for more material about that magnificent massacre. Another person might have been delighted to be a local superstar whose lips people would look up to. But the former Babaloa could only manage a quiet, inarticulate, "Huh?" The newspapers were already working at full capacity. People did not have time to turn the page without one loud headline being replaced by another, even if it was telling the same story. And the witnesses interviewed, of course, did not mince words during the interviews. They were very vocal in their praise of Maldanika, describing in vivid detail how she had beaten up a gang of racketeers, just like children retelling the events of their favorite superhero comics. No, it wasn't Dominic who told the protagonist, generously giving her a speech. It was the woman herself who opened a fresh newspaper and read out loud everything that the locals had managed to make up about her. As it turned out, it was the product of a company that is famous for its exploitation of bikes, exaggeration, and outright lies. But at least they mentioned the store. Moreover, it managed to get information about funny beer candies, which, if eaten, will change a person's voice, even if only for a short period of time. And they didn't forget about drinks with ice. For local residents, this was an unaffordable luxury, but the newspaper promised that in Mel's store, any of them would be able to buy a glass of cold, sweet treat. This delighted the main character so much that she immediately began to praise the article, forgetting how just a minute ago she had accused its creators of loving ducks. And Dominic, judging by his crooked smile, did not miss this irony. The time traveler decided to cut out a fragment of the article and save it as a keepsake when it suddenly dawned on her. Duke Guessman and Babaloa would probably read this, and what would happen then? The ancient hero gave an uncharacteristic mocking laugh and assured her that there was absolutely no need to worry about that. So Maldanika asked why. Then the man recalled how, long ago, before the incident with the release of the demon, he had bewitched the surveillance group, forcing them to never pay attention to the blonde again, so that the enemies would simply accept the article as fiction. And to be even safer, he made the bloodhounds think that the protagonist is an empty-headed fool who only knows how to do stupid things and squander money. So there will definitely be no danger. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that the young man was simply lying. He was taking revenge on Maldanika for all her jokes and attempts to make him work hard. Having finished sulking at the harmful Dominic, the girl once again carefully examined the article with the praises and asked out loud, "Will this material now reach the academy?" The main character replied that it would be very strange if none of the neighboring kids heard about it, and the young man explained that this was actually very good. Very soon, they would have no end of kids wanting to see the super-strong ant. You didn't have to be a legendary warrior who defeated demons and saved the world at just 17 years old to understand how right Dominic was. The author very clearly showed a ring of children's faces, each of which had glowing eyes. Naturally, they discussed the protagonist and what she had done to the Red Pirates. The kids couldn't wait to come and see this mysterious superwoman, and the teacher's ban only fueled this thirst. They would most likely have already run away straight from class. But one girl reminded them in a timid voice that they were not talking about an aristocrat like her and everyone else present, but about a commoner. A modern earthling would not understand the essence of the problem at all, but they were children of feudalism. They were accustomed from their earliest years to the fact that people are not born equal, and that the nobility is superior to the common people in everything. And therefore the story about the exploits of some shopkeeper clearly smacks of fiction. In addition, the little girl reasonably noted that even a real nobleman would have a hard time dealing with a whole crowd of experienced thugs accustomed to shedding blood, especially in splendid isolation, as the same newspapers write. This was enough to make the opinion of the noble children turn around 180 degrees. Now, some haughtily raised their noses and agreed that this was clearly nonsense, and someone even added in horror that you can catch some kind of disease from the rabble. In response to the latter, even the other children added that all these rumors about terrible diseases were just rumors. But the suspicious boy still believed that the peasants and other common people were too scary. Then the conversation gradually moved on to the store itself. These characters also could not understand that Maldanika had even come up with such a thing. It was too outrageous for them. And then the conversation somehow smoothly flowed to the products from Duke Gessman. And this was heard by very familiar ears under the blonde hair. Of course, it turned out to be Axion, familiar to readers, the young second prince, whom Mel and Dominic mistook for an ordinary little nobleman. And the blonde was taken aback when he finally realized that all this time they were talking about his, so to speak, fiancé. The girls and boys immediately began to whisper, no longer daring to express their opinions openly and frankly. But the prince simply had no time for that. He was trying to digest the information he had heard. From his thoughts, it became clear that the Red Pirates had dared to attack Axion on that fateful day. And now the young fool in love decided that Maldanika had somehow found out about this and taken revenge for her future groom. The woman in his imagination immediately appeared as a powerful and noble knight, on whom the armor sat as beautifully as the dresses, and this image displaced all other thoughts from the prince's head. It is unknown how long the lovesick child would have stood there and continued to dream, but someone's question pulled him out of these sweet fantasies. "Hey, do you want to go with me to this Mel's stationery store?" The emperor's youngest son did not answer right away. He measured his new interlocutor with a long look, thinking about the fact that this guy had been transferred to their academy quite recently. The boy was about the same age as Axion, but his name was Karat. He had black hair and eyes the color of spring ice. Overall, he looked very much like a younger version of Dominic or Lennox, although he looked much friendlier than them. And the prince, unlike most, knew that this boy was not an ordinary child, but a secret agent of the Wizard's Tower, who had infiltrated the academy on a secret mission from the adult aristocracy. Recently, small nobles have started to mysteriously disappear in the capital, and only those who possessed witchcraft. Some villains were behind this, and thanks to Karat, it was already possible to successfully prevent a tragedy twice. He had the ability to easily knock down grown men, but even the young agent admitted that the Red Pirates were a very dangerous group, primarily because many of them were sorcerers themselves. That's why the boy couldn't understand how an ordinary store owner managed to defeat all these thugs, but he was clearly determined to find out in the near future. So far, Karat could only note that the mysterious Mel was a very strong, and as a result, dangerous person. It was even possible that she was the leader of the child kidnappers, and the battle with the pirates was, in fact, a fight between two hungry sharks for territory. Axion, despite his general knowledge of the interlocutor's identity, had no idea what he was thinking about, so he innocently agreed, especially since Maldanika had long asked him to visit her with his friend. After this, the boys agreed to warn the mistress by letter and visit her together at the first opportunity, and then the readers were shown the huge imperial castle and fragments from the message of the younger prince to the elder. The young prince, with the innocence typical of children, asked Xiang to go with him to this store, promising that he would definitely like it. But the gray-haired youth's face was not affected by such news and offers. Having finished sighing, the man mentally reproached himself. He had unforgivably delayed the start of the investigation into this strange shop, and was now reaping the fruits of his careless slowness. The first prince took a pen, wrote a few short words on the paper, "I will follow you," and then sent it to his little brother via carrier pigeon. Now he was going to find out exactly what such a strange and powerful man was doing near the academy. From the young man's reflections, it became clear that the old emperor had a very numerous offspring. At different points in his life, the sovereign had produced 8 children, but almost all of them died at a young age from strange diseases, so that their number was reduced to 2. Xian was the second eldest, while Axion was the youngest, born 8th. But despite such a huge difference in age, the royal brothers were incredibly close to each other. The gray-haired youth stared at the portrait of himself in his imperial robe next to his younger brother for a while, until he mentally swore an oath to make Mel's life hell if she ever offended the young prince. And then he casually ordered his servant to bring him the teleportation scroll. The young sovereign was now not going to waste even a second. He put aside all his business and prepared to immediately move to the vicinity of the Maltend Academy. After this, the action returned to the time traveler and her faithful bodyguard. They were both standing behind the counters, waiting for the first customers, when their attention was drawn to the question, "So this is the place?" Maldanika raised her eyes in surprise when she realized who exactly she was seeing in front of her. It was the memorable blonde kid who preferred to earn bruises rather than give his old box to his mysterious offenders. They looked at each other in shock for perhaps a good half-minute, until they finally came to their senses. The former Babaloa took a step forward, politely greeting her little friend, and he ran up with his arms outstretched in delight. The beauty of the moment was spoiled only by the fact that the woman, for the life of her, could not remember the name of this little golden-haired hidalgo. Mel was not even sure that she had ever heard him say his name. The prince himself came to the rescue. Not noticing the discomfort of his interlocutor, he called himself Zion and boasted that all the wounds had long since healed, to which the protagonist mentally responded with praise, like, "Well done, guy, you saved me from shame." And the blonde, without moving from his place, hastened to add that he had brought a friend, as he had promised, and showed Karat standing at a distance, who now looked much colder and more wary. True, in his excitement, he slightly mangled the young wizard's name, calling him Karotom, which sounds very similar to the English name for carrots, and the brunette corrected the prince with slight indignation. While the boys were arguing and bickering over how Axion always mangled the black-haired boy's name, the protagonist was trying to digest the fact that children, real little children, had actually come to her stationery store. The main character, one might say, drowned in her fantasies from joy. It was as if she had been transported to her native South Korea, where everything was so familiar, habitual, and understandable, unlike this fantasy Middle Ages. At first, she was going to engage the kids in games so that they would have a great time, and then, as if in passing, offer them to try those very beer candies that would make the young consumers a little more like adults. At one point, she quietly called out to Karat and Axion, drawing their attention to her modest person. And then she spread her arms, smiled very warmly, and happily announced, "Welcome to Mel's stationery store." At least it didn't work with the little brunette. He was not a child first and foremost, but a special agent of the Tower of Magicians. And now he was coldly and intently studying the suspicious woman, trying to understand what her secret was. He quickly came to the conclusion that Maldanika was an absolutely ordinary woman and did not represent anything serious in a fight. But her servant, Dominic, looked much more dangerous, and it was even stranger that he somehow ended up under her thumb. Thinking about all this, the young magician came to a terrible guess. What if the blonde is actually so smart and powerful that she is able to perfectly hide her true power from those around her, pretending to be an ordinary girl? While Mel cooed at Zion, asking him what he loved and wanted most, Karat mentally rolled his eyes and sighed deeply. This dim-witted prince had managed to swallow not only the hook, but also the line and sinker, and in such a short time. From the magician's point of view, the emperor's offspring looked like a complete idiot, babbling some nonsense, a lovesick fool with a besotted look. And the brunette was sincerely surprised how one could be so stupid, even if he drank a love potion, for example. At this point, the point of view shifted to Askion and Maldenica. The fair-haired boy noticed some strange things, and the woman kindly explained that they were soap bubbles. She never had time to test this product, but why not arrange a small experiment together? And the prince, of course, agreed, and with such enthusiasm that Karat almost cursed out loud. It was as if a switch had been flipped in his head by a terrible guess. In fact, Mel is a bloodthirsty, mad scientist conducting cruel experiments on children, and now he needs to escape at any cost and report the danger to his superiors. Now he would not even think of treating the blonde with contempt or condescension. On the contrary, fear settled in the heart of the young wizard. and when the heroine looked intently straight at him, the brunette felt his insides turn cold. Naturally, the protagonist was never the monster that the young agent's wild imagination had managed to paint her as. And, noticing that the second boy was looking straight at her, the former Babaloa only smiled kindly. But from this sweet look, a lightning bolt seemed to run down Karat's spine. He decided that the situation had become too dangerous, and now he needed to stop the bloodthirsty child killer with his spells at any cost. Fortunately, it didn't come to blows on the spot. Instead, the audience was shown children and adults standing on the street, facing each other, like cowboys and outlaws from old Wild West movies. The protagonist took out a jar of soapy liquid and innocently suggested that they begin the entertainment, and the young wizard belligerently clenched his fists and ordered them to begin, with such fervor that even Axion raised his eyebrows in confusion. The blonde brought a wet stick with a round hole at the end to her lips, carefully breathed on it, and a flock of beautiful soap bubbles, shimmering in the light of the setting sun, flew into the air. It was such an unusual and beautiful sight that even Karat was taken aback, unable to bring himself to carry out an attack. As for the prince, he was simply fascinated and reached out to the bubbles with his hands. As soon as he touched the soap figurine for even a moment, something even more unusual happened. It burst, but did not disappear without a trace, but turned into a beautiful flower of a soft pink color. And soon, the rest of the bubbles began to turn into similar flowers. Like beer candies, this trinket contained simple, but funny and beautiful magic. Carrot, judging by his surprised pink face, even agreed with this. He unclenched his fists, forgot about all his worries and bad assumptions about Mel, and now could only watch the petals in fascination. Because of this, among other things, the young sorcerer did not notice how the protagonist approached him from behind, with a bottle and an offer to try to create the bubbles himself. The kid clearly understood deep down that there was nothing dangerous in Maldenic, but he was too proud to admit it right away. So he continued to convince himself that the bubbles should be tried, but only to see if they were dangerous. Having carefully examined the offered vessel, the young sorcerer quickly felt a weak charge of magical energy in it, and also realized that the product was not yet for sale due to the lack of a label. Slowly raising his wand to his face and exhaling to the general laughter, Karat felt very strange. After all, initially, he just wanted to make sure that there were no dark spells here. However, now the brunette felt as if he was in a dream, a joyful, happy dream, where delicate pink petals were flying everywhere, softly falling to the ground. Having felt this properly, the previously wary and cold agent of the Sorcerer's Order finally allowed himself to openly blush and smile with delight, as befits an ordinary child. He himself didn't know where this strange, warm feeling came from, but there was no doubt that the newcomer had managed to win herself another friend and ally, almost without making any effort. However, this blissful moment did not last long. Then Karat stared in horror at his own hands, realizing how much and impermissibly he allowed himself to relax and immerse himself in fantasies. Then Maldenika came up to him and asked if the kid had enjoyed the entertainment, and the brunette, turning even redder, looked at the girl with fear and indignation. The protagonist clearly interpreted this silence in her own way, so with a radiant smile, she explained that it was a flower gift, clearly implying a transformation trick. After a few minutes, Karat felt real horror. His increased heart rate, uncharacteristically strong emotions, and other things that were too suspicious to be natural. Chaotic, screaming thoughts were born one after another, like fry and caviar. Now the guy began to think about why someone like Mel needed to go into conflict with the Red Pirates at all. But instead of asking the question point blank in a menacing voice, forcing the vile witch to confess to all her crimes and taking her to prison, the young brunette asked if Babaloa could do something similar again. And when he realized what he had blurted out, he covered his mouth with his hands in fear. Now Carrot had turned completely red, like a ripe carrot, and he had finally convinced himself that Maldenika was a deadly and cunning sorceress, because how else could it be explained? Then the main character offered the first visitors to try some slush, and the young wizard interpreted this as some kind of dangerous poison, and then mentally swore to avoid trying it at any cost. As it turned out a little later, it wasn't even the possibility of dying that scared the boy, but the fact that the blonde could enchant him with this mysterious potion, forcing him to be her crazy admirer, like the unfortunate Prince Axion. In the end, it turned out that the sinister slush was nothing more than an ordinary treat, albeit a very tasty one, and Karat, naturally, tried it. Later, he might start cursing himself for an attack of willfulness, but damn, how delicious it was. And while he was struggling with himself, Zion continued to talk carelessly to Maldenica. In particular, he admitted that people like her always behaved kindly towards him, and that is precisely why he would like the protagonist to become his wife. And Dominic, realizing in which direction the conversation was going, hastened to leave with an emotionless expression on his face. But there was more to it. Instead of asking Babaloa's ex to wait until he reached at least adolescence, Axion asked the blonde to become his older brother's wife. It was at that moment that there was a polite but firm knock on the door, and the knight, opening it slightly, saw an unknown young man, with suspiciously familiar, long hair tied in a ponytail. A very funny and awkward scene ensued. While the two men were silently staring at each other in the doorway, the protagonist turned around to ask who had come, and the blonde boy gasped. Naturally, he shouted that this gray-haired but young stranger was his very own older sibling, who had kept his promise to show up early. And for the first time in a long time, the girl felt the ground slipping out from under her feet. But one had to give the newcomer her due. She had a natural salesman's streak, so as soon as she got her bearings, she smiled warmly at the new visitor and welcomed him into her store. In response, Sion only cast a thoughtful, even slightly sad glance at her with his deep blue eyes. And the atmosphere in the room somehow subtly changed, as if fresh, lush greenery had sprouted somewhere nearby. Of course, the platinum blonde immediately recognized the outrageous young Duchess Maldenica Babaloa, and the protagonist herself quickly realized that she was seeing the first prince, although she was surprised at how young he turned out to be. While the main characters were trying to come to their senses and find the right words, Axion didn't notice anything strange. He only reacted with slight surprise to the fact that his brother, it turns out, was already acquainted with Mel. Being a straightforward and spontaneous child, he saw in this a sign of fate itself, blessing the potential union between the protagonist and Zion. But the girl herself was only trying to recover from the shock, because she understood who exactly her little golden-haired admirer was. To the girl's credit, the book mentioned that the youngest prince, having fallen ill, decided to go to the villa to restore his health, so she did not expect that one day she would accidentally meet the youngest, beloved son of the emperor. When she slurred the words, "Prince Axion," the little boy confirmed with a bright and innocent smile that it was true. He was indeed second in line to the throne. As a result, all the characters sat down at one round table, but tension hung between them. No matter how brave and even impudent the newcomer was, even she was now tormented by fears that executioners would come for her and Dominic's souls in order to punish them for disrespecting the crown. The little blonde boy, meanwhile, was amazed that his failed bride, it turns out, was also a very high-born and important person, and the heroine admitted in a dejected tone that she could not even imagine that Zion was simply an abbreviation of his real name. After this, the boy again proposed to the time traveler to marry his older brother, and deathly silence reigned at the table again. Even Dominic gasped and accidentally broke off a piece from the wooden surface of the table. It sounded so wild. But the worst of all was probably for Karat. While the other characters were already recovering from their surprise and resuming their conversation, the young sorcerer began to silently howl, not understanding what kind of devilry was going on in the area. Axion sighed with false heaviness, muttering that everyone loved him, even Mel, while Zion calmly noted that the former Duchess had become very close to his younger brother in such a short time. The blonde tried to explain that it happened by chance, but the boy managed to screw her over even here, enthusiastically adding that Maldenica had saved him. The girl mentally howled no worse than Karat. She immediately understood that the little blonde, without wanting to, was making her look like a selfish profiteer in front of one of the most powerful people in the world. After thinking for a moment, the first prince politely but firmly asked why the protagonist decided to help his brother and why she decided to become the head of the stationery store, and Mel felt like she really wanted to run to the toilet. After this, the main character, already as a narrator, explained to the audience that Cassion's date of birth fell on a dark period in the country's history. At that time, The emperor's power was incredibly weak, and the gray-haired youth managed to become the heir primarily thanks to the help of the ill-fated Lennox, his childhood friend. He later graduated from the academy with excellent grades, demonstrating incredible talents. Even if he had been born an ordinary nobleman, the silver-haired man could easily have become the greatest prime minister in the history of the state. Naturally, the author made him fall in love with Sharia Babaloa by organizing a love triangle between her and two friends. Although, to be fair, Gesman was never that close to the future sovereign. Naturally, the protagonist desperately did not want to have anything to do with this sickening story, so she clearly decided to divert the storm from herself by meekly saying that the stationery store was just a dream. She failed many times until she finally realized that she no longer wanted to have anything to do with big business, that dark ocean full of bloodthirsty sharks, but would much rather do something less significant, but pleasant, bringing joy. And technically, she did not lie a single word. Her only truly desired reward was children's laughter. As long as the children were happy, she herself would be at the height of bliss, and that was all she needed. Of course, she wouldn't mind even if His Highness decided to visit the shop from time to time. And she mentally added that even if Cassian didn't believe it, then so be it. She didn't want to do any business with him. Well, okay. She could ask for one small favor, but Maldanika hadn't voiced it yet. Axion, who had clearly heard the vulgar rumors about Mel and was now indignantly asking his brother to scold all these gossips, interrupted the conversation. However, Sion did not pay any attention to this. Instead, he harshly but reasonably reminded that the protagonist would not be allowed to live and work in peace. She had developed too bad a reputation and many high-ranking enemies. The former Duchess of Babaloa took a long time to respond, trying to decide whether she should take the words as a warning or a disguised request, before replying, "I won't be naive, and you will also be my enemy." After some thought, the eldest prince allowed himself to smile slightly, bow his head, and calmly remark that no, he was not interested in confronting the main character for now. In response, Maldanika only said, "That's how it is," and smiled very broadly and sincerely, as if the conversation had been about some kind of good-natured friendly joke all this time, and not about life and death. And then finally, the most precious, most long-awaited moment for the protagonist arrived. She gave Axion and Karat whole bags filled with various treats. Among the treats was, among other things, a very strange candy that looked like a full beer mug with a foaming surface. But fortunately, it was completely non-alcoholic. The black-haired boy said that was impossible, and Babaloa instantly knew from his eyes that he was the perfect client, the kind of kid who desperately wanted to look older but was hesitant to cross a taboo. So she told him in detail how she made these sweets. Seeing how the little wizard's cheeks turned pink, the newcomer directly stated that he looked happy. And when she added that the sweets also had a small magical effect, Karat, together with Axion, could no longer contain themselves and squealed with delight. Very pleased with the effect produced, the woman advised the boys to definitely try it, check the effect, and, as if by chance, asked about advertising among the other kids. Naturally, the younger prince agreed without hesitation, almost wagging his tail with delight, while the young wizard only looked away. But his scarlet cheeks betrayed the true emotions of his master completely. As it turned out, she had a gift for Prince Cassian too, but it certainly wasn't a playful candy, for this man was distinguished by rare perfectionism and a very strong attachment to his relatives. Because of this, and because of his status, the white-haired youth was incredibly cautious in his acquaintances and very rarely got close to anyone on a personal level, excluding his father and brother. And when his nanny and sisters died, the poor guy began to suffer from nightmares. The traveler had no idea whether the imperial family was being haunted by an evil fate or some completely mortal killer, because even the author of the original story did not write about it. But fortunately, she could help with the nightmares. In addition, in the book, Sharia became a living emotional support for the gray-haired prince. Every time she stroked him, his fears retreated, which became the basis for Cassian's love. But Maldanika was going to influence the course of events a little. Returning from the second floor, where many things were stored that were not yet ready to be displayed on the shelves, the protagonist solemnly demonstrated to the highborn guest an elegant dream catcher, seemingly made of silver. There had never been Indians in this world, so the princes did not understand what kind of strange artifact it was, but the main character happily explained the principles of its operation, although Axion could hardly believe that this thing could only give good dreams. The girl easily admitted that it might be hard to believe in something like that, but the artifact was indeed useful, and the brothers measured her with deep, thoughtful looks. The gray-haired youth quickly sensed the magic power in the catcher, and the protagonist lied that it was woven by a novice wizard. In fact, it was Dominic, and he was so angry about the deception that he was ready to eat his employer alive and without salt as soon as the guests walked through the door. The traveler whispered to the bodyguard for forgiveness and promised to compensate for this with a higher salary in the future. And Cassian, having finished examining the gift, smiled warmly and thanked the owner of the shop. The heir to the throne had previously heard only bad rumors about the former Babeloa, that she was a short-sighted, greedy, and vile fool, a disgrace to her glorious family, and also interfered with the relationship of Lennox Gessman and Sharia out of envy of their true love. Now that he had spoken to the woman in person, he clearly found it very hard to believe that it was really the ill-fated Maldanika in front of him, and the man was so deep in thought that his younger brother had to call him back to reality. The young man could not understand how a person could change so much, but of course he did not reveal his thoughts to his brother and the others. Instead, the siblings decided to leave the store. The next day, the golden-haired boy came to the academy with his bag of goodies from Mel and good-naturedly invited those around him to try her sweets. And the first to be snapped up were, of course, the famous beer candies. Children gobbled them up with great pleasure, because for some, they reminded them of their parents' products, and for others, they were simply happy, feeling almost like adults. Carrot also took part in this distribution, although he did not understand why he was doing such nonsense at all. He initially just wanted to make sure that Maldenica was not the organizer of the kidnappings of noble children wizards. While those around him were fooling around with their changed voices, and Axion was angrily demanding that he show more activity in their little advertising campaign, the young wizard finally understood that he had to contact his superiors. Let them check Mel's shop now. Then, a boy and a girl approached the youngest imperial offspring. They were interested in whether His Highness had tried such candies and whether his vocals had changed. The young blonde readily confirmed that this was so, and again mentioned Maldenika's shop, and the couple immediately became embarrassed, having learned that they were talking about that very strange establishment with a commoner owner. They didn't like it, and the girl was also frightened by the fact that there used to be a creepy abandoned house on the site of the shop, and while Axion was trying to convince them otherwise, a certain black-haired girl was closely following his every word. It was Marissa Gessman, Lennox's little illegitimate sister, who had realized from the very beginning that it was her brother's former fiancé who was being talked about and was very eager to visit her, but was afraid of running into hatred and contempt because of the sins of her wayward relative. And then the little girl almost screamed when she remembered her brother's letter, where he practically threatened to withdraw family support if the girl did not immediately stop doing nonsense. Thinking about it some more, the little brunette became very angry and began to scold the Duke in every way for such a cheap attempt to stop her. If she had ever admired her older sibling, seen him as a model of a man and an example to follow, then that time was gone forever. Now Lennox had become just a stupid cheater. A little later, readers were shown how Maldenika was calmly working in her store, when suddenly a joyful cry was heard from the passageway. "Guys, this is the very same store!" The word-of-mouth method more than paid for itself. 3 little children came to the main character and looked at her with admiration, and one girl even babbled that the protagonist looked like an angel. Having explained that they had come at the invitation of the younger Prince Axion, the children immediately began to demand even more of those cool voice-changing candies, and the time traveler was only happy about this. Hearing that these 3 little ones also had pockets full of money, Maldenaka became even more touched, and then, in the most unctuous voice possible, she asked whether they specifically wanted those very sweets. Words cannot describe the titanic efforts she had to make to maintain that smile when one child seriously asked for a treat that would completely take away her voice, and another for an artifact that would give pain. Naturally, she would never in her life give such dangerous things to anyone. She didn't want to end up in prison. But you can't explain that to kids, So the blonde tried a more subtle method of persuasion. Putting on her most mysterious and conspiratorial face, Maldanika offered the kids something much better, and then snapped her fingers and demanded that one, special candy from Dominic. Fortunately, the knight understood her from the very first word, so he brought the necessary things flawlessly quickly, sweets that changed the color of the eater's tongue and mouth for a while. Overjoyed, the children began to praise the hostess, claiming that she was not even an angel, but simply a genius. And the blonde again felt a chill run down her spine from the puzzled look of the true creator of delicacies. Lately, she has been praised very often for any achievements, whether it was the Dominikovs or someone else's, and this has even begun to frighten the protagonist, as if higher powers had suddenly decided to make her their favorite. The woman didn't have time to finish this thought, because one of the visitors suddenly noticed that the ant's arm was covered with some strange black pattern, like a tattoo. Sweating even more from the bad feeling, Maldanika raised her hand to her eyes, but found nothing but completely clean light skin, and the baby noted with no less surprise that the mark was gone. He clearly decided that he had been deceived and had frightened the kind girl in vain, so he hurried to apologize. But the adults were no longer listening. They looked at each other tensely. After this, the main character decided to quickly send the visitors away. They promised that they would definitely come again, and the time traveler asked her not to forget to bring her friends with her. Despite the warning signs, the protagonist was very happy. The second day of the buyer's visit went without a hitch, which meant that her idea had really started to work. In fact, the blonde was so happy about this that a few seconds later, she just went and without warning, wrapped Dominic in a bear hug. This made the young man turn purple and sweat, and therefore, he politely but firmly pulled the girl away from him and asked her never to do that again, which genuinely surprised Maldanik. Babaloa began to forget that biologically, her bodyguard was only 17 years old, but it was not only that. As it turned out, the knight also took an oath to the gods that he would certainly remain celibate until he married someone. The newcomer was taken aback by this confession. After all, she had hugged Dominic simply as a friend, without even thinking about any perversions. So what the hell had bitten him? Offended, the blonde said, "I heard you, and if that's what you want, then live your whole life in chastity." But the scandal didn't have time to flare up, because someone else suddenly entered the store. It turned out to be Marissa Gessman. After reading various books, she decided to disguise herself as a stereotypical spy, with a black mask on half her face and a black cloak with a hood. But this only made her look more suspicious. While the main characters were trying to figure out what this meant, the girl took a ripe red apple out of her bag, held it out with trembling hands, and explained in the same weak voice that this gesture meant an apology. To say that from Mel's point of view, this situation seemed incredibly strange would be a huge understatement. But since her interlocutor was a child, Babaloa did not have the audacity to offend her by refusing. The blonde accepted the apple, but in order not to remain in debt, she handed the mysterious visitor a golden, star-shaped lollipop. Marissa almost burst into tears, not understanding why the main character would even show such feelings towards her. And the protagonist, kneeling down, explained that all children deserve affection and love. By the way, she never recognized the sister of the failed groom, so she telepathically asked Dominic who this guest could be. But the brunette indifferently replied that he had no idea. It could be a stalker. There was no need to guess, however. The little brunette herself took off her mask and hood, said her name, and tearfully asked for forgiveness for all the shit that her older brother had managed to do with his mistress. Now that Marissa was convinced that Maldanika was an angel in the flesh, she felt even more ashamed for Lennox, and for the main character too. After all, what kind of freak do you have to be not be embarrassed by such a kind little angel? The former Earthling thought with longing why all cheaters behave in such a stupid and brazen manner, flaunting their disgusting relationships after a while, or not even trying to hide them in the first place. Out loud, she tried to convince young Gessman that she shouldn't ask for forgiveness for other people's crimes, but the girl didn't seem to hear it. She shared that she had been watching the protagonist for some time. She saw how genuinely kind the former Babaloa had been to those 3 children, and she was convinced that all the bad rumors were completely false. And then she abruptly and forcefully pulled the hood back over her head. Marissa was so embarrassed that she simply couldn't continue talking, so she ran away, apologizing for it and promising to come back some other time. The main characters watched her go in silence for a while, until they finally admitted that this girl was completely different from her selfish and cruel relative. Specifically, Maldanika made a silent promise to herself. When little Guessman appears in her shop again, she will receive so many sweets as a gift that any sad grimace will immediately disappear, giving way to a smile. After this, the action moved to a completely different place. A magnificent feast was being held in the open air, noble ladies and gentlemen were dancing, and at the head of the table sat a suspiciously familiar black-haired man. Naturally, it was Lennox himself, who decided to throw another ball, and numerous guests discussed his riches with delight and envy. For example, a real magic tree growing among ordinary plants in the garden. Then it turned out that the elder Hessman was planning to establish good relations with a certain magical kingdom, which made an even greater impression on the aristocrats. This state enjoyed the glory of being the homeland of legendary heroes. The Duke himself pretended that he wasn't there at all, just standing there with his arms crossed and his eyes closed, but his thoughts were floating in completely different spheres. But in fact, he was carefully catching every word that was said. Almost every aspect of his plan went off without a hitch, except for the contacts with the aforementioned magical kingdom, where Lennox was shown the door in no uncertain terms, much to his disappointment. Unlike the Empire, that state was inhabited not only by humans, but also by other intelligent creatures who had magic in their blood. So an alliance with them would be terribly advantageous, not to mention the fact that Hessman was trying to find Dominic's legendary sword, not suspecting that it had already served Maldanika. If he could enlist the support of an army of dwarves, elves, and mermaids, and also subjugate the greatest warrior in history, then the brunette would become the most powerful man in the world, even without the dragon children. And then the imperial crown would be easier to pick than a ripe fruit. Lennox would have enjoyed these fantasies for a very long time, reveling in his own genius and exceptionalism, if someone's childish voice, as if in response to all these thoughts, had not asked, "Mom, but isn't the owner of the magic tower better than him?" It turned out to be a little aristocrat, whom his mother decided to take with her to the reception. And this young man, like Marissa and Axion, clearly saw the rotten insides of the main antagonist, hidden behind the image of a refined and rich nobleman. Naturally, his mother was not going to give him the opportunity to continue making such dangerous speeches, especially in close proximity to Lennox himself, so she ordered him to shut up, allegedly because it was too noisy. However, it was too late. The brunette heard and remembered everything perfectly well, and therefore decided to address his dear visitors with some very important announcement. A few minutes later, it turned out that this news was an alliance between the Guessman and Babaloa clans, and this caused real delight among the guests, because, by joining forces, these two financial giants would become truly invincible. While everyone was clapping enthusiastically, Duke Babaloa quietly addressed Lennox, warning him that he had something to tell him concerning Maldanika, but it would have to be done in private. When the men retired to the estate, it turned out that the protagonist's father wanted to warn the brunette that Mel had officially renounced her position and surname, and this caused a shock in Guessman because he still considered himself her fiancé. Such a thing could not be done without his approval. The eldest duke calmly replied that the main character had decided to renounce her origin of her own free will, but there was no need to worry about it in principle. The documents could be taken back as easily as they were submitted. Lennox was not entirely convinced, because such matters were decided only through the emperor, and he was not some petty solicitor who could be manipulated as one pleased. But the head of the Babaloa clan replied with slight contempt that this was Maldanika, a hysterical fool. She would never seriously want to be in exile. He remembered how once his daughter, having failed yet again, and having received the threat of excommunication from the family, sat in her father's office for 3 whole days, not eating any food, not sleeping, and all for the sake of her parent relenting and not carrying out the promised punishment. Since then, the man could not take Mel seriously. For him, she was a parasite, a useless ballast, who, however, understands her situation and will do anything to avoid being left overboard. As for the emperor, the blonde man didn't really care about him. His opinion on such matters meant no more than one small tick, and the aristocrats mostly resolved such matters on their own. This seemed to calm Lennox down, So the elder Babaloa hastened to add that even if Maldanika really wanted to leave, what was the problem with that? The brunette could simply get engaged to Sharia, and everyone would be happy. Naturally, Guessman did not tell the fat man what a treasure the protagonist really was, and why he needed her so much. So he only smiled politely and admitted that he would prefer to keep the blonde's noble status. And this alerted the second duke. Perhaps he allowed his wife to manipulate him, but he was not a complete idiot and understood that the failed son-in-law had some special interest and did not plan to share its essence with others. Here, he cast an irritated glance at a man who was very persistently simulating a cough right next to his ear. He wanted to tell Patriarch Babaloa some very important rumors. Naturally, they were referring to Maldanika, and her father, realizing this, felt for a moment as if he had been struck by an invisible but incredibly powerful lightning bolt. The fat man didn't even listen to what exactly the informer was going to tell him. He was so angry that he screamed throughout the palace that this vile wretch had completely lost her mind, and yet it seemed like she was finally starting to grow up. For a few more minutes, the respectable, noble man of a certain age was hysterical and stamping his feet like a child, before finally asking what kind of crap the protagonist had come up with this time. And the frightened servant mumbled about a business near the academy. This had a better effect on the Duke than a bucket of ice water. He instantly stopped raging and in a very calm, even businesslike tone, asked how things were going with his daughter, trying to choose his words very carefully so as not to cause another storm. The gossip admitted that he had recently heard a lot about a mysterious stationery store that had gained incredible popularity among noble children, and its owner suddenly turned out to be Maldanika. Patriarch Babaloa's reaction was still stormy, although not furious. He shouted again that a wretched shop like the ones commoners had was not even funny. Even a complete fool could handle such a lousy job. The fat man froze again, as if struck by lightning, when the informer, stuttering and trembling all over, added that the protagonist's character had completely changed. The children adore her, considering her a benefactor. The Duke simply could not believe this anymore. He understood perfectly well that he had turned his daughter's life into hell, because he had never loved either her or her mother, and therefore knew that the disgusting character of the real Maldanika was a response to the painful kicks of the surrounding world. It all sounded incredibly strange and fantastic, so the elderly aristocrat decided to think very hard about the changes in the life of his unloved first daughter, and for this, he casually ordered the servant to get out. While Patriarch Babaloa was puzzled over the unexpected riddle, his second wife, the beautiful Lady Hildegard, whose hair resembled a shock of scarlet flame, was leisurely strolling through the beautiful garden, and she was very unhappy because her dear, although usually narrow-minded husband, somehow managed to find out about the prodigal daughter's new business, and then threw a scandal because his wife kept him in the dark. The man still considered the main character to be trash, and had no intention of establishing a good relationship with her. However, he was still interested in how she was doing, so the protagonist should soon expect the priest to appear on her doorstep. From the outside, Hildegard might have seemed mostly calm, but in reality, the Duchess was seething with rage. This damn pig was going to return his first offspring back to the clan. He just couldn't decide on his desires. She had never loved the elder Babaloa, but she openly despised this chaotic trait of his character, seeing in it almost a mockery of herself. And what was worst of all, even those cutthroats, the Red Pirates, were unable to cope with the hated stepdaughter. The Villainess simply did not understand the latter. Maldanika had never been distinguished by her military talents and did not know how to cast spells, and in her service was only a novice and very weak wizard. But somehow she beat the crowd of bone breakers, and therefore was dangerous for Hildegard and Sharia. This finally confirmed the aristocrat in the idea that the main character needed to be finished off as quickly as possible and at any cost. But she didn't have time to finish this thought. The maid approached the red-haired lady and respectfully replied that everything was ready. This news made the red-haired antagonist smile sincerely for a moment and forget about her recent troubles, and she ordered the maid to follow her to a certain place. It turned out to be a luxurious banquet hall with a laid table at which sat exclusively young, beautiful aristocrats, and Hildegard sat at the head of this table, like a queen surrounded by loyal subjects. Sipping her tea gracefully from an expensive mug, the Duchess finally began her speech. She and her family had decided to enter into a mutually beneficial alliance with Duke Lennox Guessman to ensure a comfortable future for their descendants, and the ladies at the table received this with delight. But as soon as the older woman mentioned her wayward adopted daughter Maldanika, who had decided to start some kind of business again, her friends began to giggle nastily. Like, this fool has decided to disgrace herself again. Life hasn't taught her anything. However, Hildegard, without even opening her dreamily narrowed eyes, admitted that she was actually very proud of this girl, who, despite all the adversity, stubbornly continues to work on herself, and she would like Sharia to work together with her older sister. The gossips were a little embarrassed by this unexpected turn of the conversation, but not much. They just started covering their faces with fans and sleeves, obsequiously groaning and gasping and whispering among themselves, of course. The Duchess, with hypocritical modesty, asked her friends not to embarrass her like that. But in reality, of course, she was cold and focused, like a snake ready to strike. And this whole conversation was nothing more than the first point of a plan that would turn the main character's life into hell. Some other person might have sooner or later resigned himself to the existence of the hated stepdaughter, limited himself to banishing her and trying to forget her, like a bad dream. But Hildegard was never content with half measures. Meanwhile, Maldanika herself was desperately bored until she finally decided to complain to Dominic. Many hours had passed, but there was not a single visitor in their store. Maybe she made some mistake? The knight turned around with interest, and the girl continued her thought. What if the audience decided to forget about her because their stationery store was run not by a noblewoman, even of a low rank, but by a mere commoner? The euphoric effect of a successful business start had passed, and now the protagonist was faced with the harsh reality. People were not ready to march to her in crowds every day, and you can't last long on a flock of children who don't care about class division. It is unknown how long she would have been thinking about how to become even more popular and earn more money, because her and Dominic's attention was drawn to a cautious but firm and loud knock on the door. The black-haired warrior reacted to this in a very unusual way. Without letting go of the box, he darkened and muttered angrily, as if this annoying bastard had decided to show up again and waste their time. This surprised the main character very much, because she could not remember anyone to whom the young bodyguard would react in such a way, especially since in fact Prince Cashin came to visit them with a message for the blonde. No, it was not a letter or an invitation, as one might think at first glance. The imperial heir decided to show his new acquaintance one of those strange leaflets that were now appearing all over the city. Naturally, the protagonist accepted the piece of paper and began to read it. But as soon as the meaning of what was written reached her, the former Duchess of Babaloa felt her body covered in a sticky, cold sweat. As soon as the main character regained control over her body, she rushed out of the store, only managing to shout gratitude to the dumbfounded prince. But such a reaction, in fact, could be understood, because the leaflet announced the construction of a large shopping center next to the academy, and Hildegard had arranged it. But even that wasn't the worst of it. The red-haired brat was clearly intending to force her stepdaughter out of the business, because the main audience of her enterprise was supposed to be high-born children, and Duke Hessman was working with her. Only 10 minutes had passed, and now Maldanika was looking on with a shocked expression as the construction crew laid bricks and boards on top of each other. Her stepmother didn't even have the conscience to move the future department store to the other end of the street. The protagonist was no fool, so she immediately understood what all this meant, and even more acutely realized that if she did not take some immediate action, the damned stepmother would easily throw her to the side of the business. The main character even mentally asked her hated relatives why, even after everything that had happened, they wouldn't leave her alone. They simply wouldn't let her live her own life. Or would it be necessary to break everyone's backs and leave them lying in the dust? Then one of the builders approached her and warned her that the girl had come very close to the fenced area. But he was even confused when Maldanika coldly asked what exactly they were working on here. The blonde acted so coldly and majestically that the builder mistook her for an inspector and meekly replied that work was underway on creating a children's department store, although this had not yet been confirmed, and the exact completion date could not yet be named. The former Earthling thought even harder. Hildegard's plan was thought out to the smallest detail, and it would be very difficult to find a suitable argument for it, but she again did not have time to finish her thought. Lennox suddenly and roughly grabbed her by the arm. The time traveler very slowly raised her gaze upward, looking at her ex-fiancé with a mixture of fear and disgust. It seemed impossible to make the situation even worse than it was, but life continued to prove that this was not at all the case. The unfortunate foreman quickly realized that he had witnessed a very unpleasant sight and wisely retreated, while Guessman literally attacked the heroine, describing in vivid detail how her wretched store was doomed to ruin as soon as their enterprise started working. But the woman did not even try to listen to him. Rubbing her freed hand, she tried her best to pretend that she didn't give a damn about this man and what he was planning to do there. But gods no, this was given to Maldanika with great difficulty, and Lennox himself was not going to let her go, demanding respectful treatment without sarcasm. Having gathered her courage, the former Babaloa, with exaggerated indifference, asked the antagonist a question that made him make an angry face. Does garbage deserve to be treated seriously and respectfully? With an effort, Hessman calmly threatened that his and Hildegard's store would completely capture the attention of the little aristocrats, sending the main character to the bottom of society, unless she came to her senses and returned to him. But the protagonist did not even think of being afraid. Then Lennox decided to try the classic abuser tactic, saying that Mel was an idiot and that it was her own fault for what was happening. But the time traveler only gave the man such a look in response that anyone would want to cross themselves just in case. With each passing second, the hated Duke was infuriating the former Babaloa more and more, so much so that the remnants of sanity in her soul desperately fought in an attempt to keep her mistress from immediately attacking and attempting to kill. Luckily, common sense prevailed this time, so the blonde pointedly, calmly reminded the antagonist how he cheated on her with Sharia. So what right does a man actually have to accuse someone of idiocy? Then Lennox decided to try gaslighting. He very realistically portrayed hurt feelings and shouted that he never even thought about leaving Mel for another woman. But the newcomer coldly snapped that objective facts testify to the opposite. She reminded him in a calm, businesslike tone that Guessman had recently gone on a romantic trip with her sister, that they often appeared together at parties as a couple, and that the brunette's desperate attempts to deny this only further showed how unfaithful he was. This angered the villain almost to the point of foaming at the mouth, because he had no idea how to logically refute all this. In desperation, Lennox tried to repeat his previous words, but Maldanika wearily advised him to try himself as a clown. He is great at making people laugh with his parroting. Suddenly, the Duke grabbed her hand, but not to beat her. He decided to try another method of psychological pressure, to appease the victim with an expensive gift in the form of a precious necklace, to convince her to forgive him and return. With the real Mel, this might have worked, but the former Earthling in her body looked at the decoration with incredible disgust, as if Hessman had shoved a disgusting, stinking, slime-covered centipede between her fingers. The girl's voice broke into an angry growl and asked if this was a bribe, but the aristocrat, having regained control of himself, explained that of course not. He would not try to bribe his own fiancée to stop spreading defamatory rumors about him and Sharia. And then he leaned right up to the protagonist's face and with a poisonous, smug grin replied that it simply wouldn't have been necessary. No one would have believed the blonde. And this completely blew Maldanika's mind. It is unknown how this would have ended. Perhaps the girl would have simply bitten the guy's face with her teeth and bit off a good chunk of his nose. But it did not come to that, thanks to a small, furiously screaming figure. Emerging from around the corner, she roared, "You damn trash!" It turned out to be Marissa Guessman, in the same black camouflage cloak. Standing between her brother and the newcomer, she decisively declared that she unconditionally believed her every word. However, such support rather upset the former Babaloa than pleased her. She knew that the girl was a bastard, that she was aware of this and took all sorts of betrayals very close to her heart, and her love for children did not allow her to use this to torment Lennox. The protagonist leaned towards the brave little girl and carefully asked her not to interfere in this story. Everything was going well anyway. But the elder Guessman only rubbed his head in irritation because even his sister decided to play against him. The man sighed heavily, and then in an icy tone ordered the girl never to hurl such insults again. And only after that, he ordered her to come to him, beckoning with her fingers, like a dog. Previously, this would have probably worked, but a lot has changed since the blonde first fought back against her offenders. So the girl also decisively sent her hated relative, even calling him a moral monster. This hurt the antagonist so much that he did not have the strength to respond or continue the argument. And Marissa, meanwhile, turned to Maldenica and asked him to leave as soon as possible, so as not to stay in the presence of such scum even longer. And in general, in the child's opinion, the main character in principle should not have paid attention to what he was saying there, because who cares what kind of filth is pouring out of the mouths of rotten people? But the protagonist was so taken aback by what was happening that she could not keep up with her interlocutor. She had gathered her courage to explain to the little girl that such concern was unnecessary, because the former Babaloa, in principle, did not care about the words or opinions of the enemy. But the girl made a very cute face, and even began to cry. Lennox finally broke into the conversation to say something in his defense, but the girl looked at him with incredible hatred and contempt, and then declared that, in principle, she would not listen to such a charlatan, and even called him by his first and last name, making it clear that she no longer considered him a brother. Then the girl resolutely grabbed Mel by the hand and led her along, as if to say, "Let's get out of here, sister. We don't have to endure the company of this pig any longer." And the main character didn't really resist. At first, she was very surprised, but now she was happy. After all, karma exists in this world, and the scoundrel received sufficient punishment even without her intervention. So in the end, Maldenica only smiled affectionately and maliciously at Gessman Sr. "Well, how about you? It's nice to be the one who was brought down by a child." That's what the woman thought. But she didn't say anything out loud, instead focusing on having a fun time with Marissa. When they reached the stationery store, the former Duchess was determined to feed the girl so much that she would have no opportunity to be sad or worried. This was the least she could do in gratitude. But this suddenly came with a complication. Opening the doors, Mel saw Dominic, Zion, Axion, and Karat having a small tea party at the table. And the protagonist didn't like this at all. She loved guests, and she loved children, but she loved solvent clients much more. And these ones decided to clean out the owner's supplies, without leaving even a coin. And she also knew for sure that Dominic was to blame for this, because the usually imperturbable warrior was now very diligently hiding his eyes, avoiding meeting his mistress's gaze at any cost. The situation was already incredibly awkward, and Marissa managed to make it even more awkward. Not paying attention to the men, she again turned to Maldenica with the promise to find her the best husband in the world. From the brunette's point of view, this mythical character must be handsome, but at the same time modest, kind, and also unconditionally devoted to his bride. And she will begin the search even among those gathered, so as not to go far. From the outside, it looked very much like some kind of farcical comedy. A black-haired girl, angry and strict, was scribbling something in a small notebook, while the protagonist looked into it with a nervous and slightly strained smile. Carrot and Axion were not the right age and quickly dropped out on their own. Instead of them, the young matchmaker decided to focus on Dominic and Zion, starting with the former, and the ancient hero could think of nothing better to say than to say that he was often praised for his modesty. Marissa nodded very seriously and wrote it down, but Maldenica immediately realized that the bodyguard had simply decided to make fun of her, and at the same time to present himself in the best possible light. Who, if not her, should know how far the brunette really was from modesty. And while the search and comparison of potential suitors continued, only Karat had enough curiosity and courage to directly ask his classmate why she had suddenly decided to do this. Young Gessman seemed to emanate a black, very creepy and dangerous aura. One look at this angry little thing was enough to make anyone's knees shake, and the time traveler, of course, did not risk forbidding her to talk about the crimes of that trash. Then the girl slapped the table loudly, attracting everyone's attention, stood up and began to tell what disgusting things her older brother Lennox had done, with such aplomb and drama, as if the action was unfolding on a theater stage. But the funniest thing is that it really worked. At the very least, the children took her story very close to heart, sincerely outraged by the cruelty and depravity of the Northern Duke, whom now they could hardly call a man. However, this was only the beginning. Getting even more excited, Marissa shouted that this degenerate, whom she, by an evil joke of fate, considered a brother, was not satisfied with trampling Mel's dignity into the dirt. Now this stinking worm wants to destroy the work of her whole life. Maldanika herself felt incredibly awkward. But it became even worse when she realized that even Dominic was imbued with this performance. An almost material wave emanated from the ancient paladin, symbolizing the thirst for blood. Then the girl folded her tiny arms across her chest, cried bitterly, and gave the protagonist a solemn oath to help her in any way possible, to inform all her friends and even casual acquaintances so that they would definitely visit the store. This affected the former Earthling so much that for the first time in a long time, she thought that the real Mel Babeloa was not such a wonderful person. Even before her younger sister Sharia started dating Lennox, the blonde cruelly bullied her, even trying to knock her down the stairs. This is what the traveler tried to carefully explain to the little girl, but to no avail. Marissa authoritatively declared that it does not matter what sins the heroine has on her soul, they simply cannot be worse than the Duke's. And then it suddenly dawned on the girl. While everyone in the area was selflessly indulging in hatred towards the elder Hessman because of the little brunette, Prince Cassian maintained an awkward silence, and yet he was on friendly terms with the northern nobleman. The children also noticed that the gray-haired prince was the only person in the room who had not thrown mud at Lennox, and they looked at him questioningly, and God forbid the prince should choose the wrong answer. The protagonist expected anything, that His Highness would try to somehow justify his friend and convince the kids not to divide the world strictly into black and white. But not that the young man would suddenly smile radiantly and agree that his friend was actually a brute. This surprised the traveler very much, because in the books there was nothing like this. But in response to her question, Cassian kindly explained that he draws a clear line between personal, real relationships and interactions in public. This calmed Maldanik down a little, because the imperial heir was such a cold-blooded professional in the book, putting his emotions aside, and the young man himself, meanwhile, admitted that he had slept well for the first time thanks to the Dreamcatcher, and for this he was also ready to help in any way possible. Marissa finished writing something in her notebook, asked Zion to take a short break, and then, with a ridiculously serious air, swore an oath to find a worthy groom for little sister Mel. But the protagonist herself only looked at her with affection. And when the brunette got to the point of a repeated and very detailed list of the virtues that this hypothetical ideal husband should have, the blonde couldn't resist and laughed, because such ideal people don't exist in nature. The girl repeated that she would make every effort to find such a man, and Karat and Axion added that they would also take part in the search, and the former Babeloa almost melted with affection, looking at these small but serious and brave knights. She no longer laughed, so as not to offend the children in vain, but only thanked them for such care, and assured them that she would be looking forward to the result with great impatience. After this, the action moved a little further in time, when it was already deep night, and to a completely different place, to an academic dormitory, reminiscent of some ancient, impregnable castle. Despite the late hour, not all the children had gone to bed. Bright lights were still burning in many rooms, including Karat's. He quietly and carefully entered his room and sighed tiredly. As it turned out, the young wizard took his promise to find the perfect groom for the main character absolutely seriously, because that was the first thing he said. Then the readers were shown fragments of his memories. How after leaving the store, Marissa turned to the boys and asked them to immediately report if they suddenly saw a suitable guy. For her, the most important point remained physical beauty, but she was ready to consider any option if the candidate met the other criteria sufficiently. And Axion immediately declared that his brother should be the groom, because he was not only the best in everything, but also handsome, like a god. As for Carrot, he had no suitable adults in mind, but he solemnly promised that he would definitely find someone to consider. With fist bumps and hands raised to the sky, the three children made another promise: to make the existence of this disgusting traitor Lennox a hell, and then to restore justice by giving Maldenica true love. Axion was the first to leave, along with his brother. But before that, he ordered his friends not to let Gessman Sr. near their beloved friend under any circumstances, and Marissa added that their mission would officially begin tomorrow morning. Now the young wizard paced the room and tried to figure out where he would start. He never thought that he would do the job of a matchmaker, and he also convinced himself that he didn't like Mel that much. It was all in the name of violated justice, nothing more. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a carrier pigeon, and the presence of this bird could only mean one thing. Isaac himself, the supreme sorcerer of the Empire, wanted to talk to Karat about something. This surprised the boy greatly, because the Archmage, even taking into account his usual eccentricities and whims, usually does not start conversations so suddenly. But he, of course, took the message that was brought and began to study it. The text said that the man, as previously warned, would come to the academy on business, but due to slightly changed circumstances, would be delayed there for some time, which made the boy very happy. And there were also 7 short words in the message, barely understandable without context. I found what I had been looking for so long. But they had such a strong effect on Karat that the child almost lost the power of speech. Having recovered from the shock, the little brunette decided to type a reply message, and at the same time ask if there was a handsome, modest, noble, and sweet man in the Magic Tower, before it dawned on him that Isaac himself perfectly fits every point. The boy, without false modesty, put himself in second place in terms of physical perfection, and if we talk about that bespectacled guy, Henry, well, he was too small for the rating, half the age of even Axion or Marissa. Besides this, Carrot had his own interest in the supposed union of Isaac and Maldanica. If they got married, he would be able to spend much more time with the main character without explanation, and would get a chance to see those wonderful soap bubbles again. These fantasies inspired the young sorcerer so much that he turned pink and, against his own will, put on a wide, slightly nervous smile, and then began to scribble a reply without hesitation. In it, the kid assured the head of the order that he would wait for him with great impatience, but at the same time, as if by chance, he asked if Isaac had a woman. If the man was free, then the child would gladly introduce him to Mel. For her decency, Carrot was ready to answer with his own head. After thinking a little more about his next steps, the young brunette decided to find out as much as possible about his leader's personal life, and only then tell Axion and Marissa about him. This seemed to him the most logical option, and the black-haired boy, with a satisfied chuckle, decided that he would definitely send his interlocutor the famous beer candy Maldaniki as a gift. Isaac simply had to try it. How delicious it was! That same night, the young sorcerer had a very colorful dream. In it, Duke Gessman was a disgusting and ugly villain who tormented Mel until the noble, handsome, and brave Supreme Sorcerer arrived. The dream ended with the man, the woman, and Karat himself starting to live together as a trio, like parents and son, and everything was fine with them. And the next day, the audience was shown how the real Archmage was confusedly rereading the letter and looking at the lollipop in the shape of a beer mug. Twirling the strange treat in his hands, the dark-skinned brunette tried to understand what had bitten the little operative. In the previous report, he had not minced words, describing Babeloa as a fiend from hell, and now he was suddenly singing her praises. Then the man began to remember the first and only time he met the blonde in person. How joyful and carefree she seemed, and he thought with a smile that Maldanica must be enjoying life. Rasmus obsequiously remarked how rare and wonderful it was to see the master smile, and Isaac asked with irritation whether he had given the wizard too little work, since the latter allowed himself to be bothered by nonsense. In fact, the man was up to his ears in work, and huge dark bags had appeared under his eyes from lack of sleep. But no one paid attention to this. Instead, the junior wizard wanted to report on the failure to catch the mysterious thief, and at the same time ask if the boss had killed Mel yet. The brunette, without even blinking an eye, lied that he had originally intended to turn their main suspect into a pile of ash. But Henry had grabbed his hand like a tick and stared at him with such a touching look that the sorcerer could not overcome himself. Rasmus commented with a dejected look on how lucky Babeloa was that even their young prodigy, suspicious of even his own shadow, was enchanted by her. But wait, wasn't she a witch who was pulling the wool over everyone's eyes? The Supreme Sorcerer said that this was nonsense, and the protagonist's true secret, oddly enough, is that she is simply a very kind and sincere person. Children instinctively feel this, and therefore are drawn to her. To say that the younger sorcerer was shocked would be like saying that the ocean was a little wet. For Isaac, so detached and cold-blooded, to suddenly talk about someone like that, it clearly had to be love. Naturally, the man himself did not want to develop this topic, and therefore, with an unambiguous threat, he ordered Rasmus to shut up. Otherwise, look, he found a fashion for the boss to talk instead of catching the thief. Weren't they in cahoots? The younger sorcerer immediately backed down, but found enough courage in himself to mention one more, rather strange thing. Why did the unknown criminal steal not a cup of mana, but some useless artifacts? No matter how much he thought about it, he couldn't come up with a logical explanation. It would be the same as if an ordinary burglar broke into a rich man's house and stole worn-out and holy socks from the closet, ignoring the money and jewelry. When Isaac asked, not without irony, whether Rasmus considered the unknown villain an idiot just because he could not understand his motives, the offended servant grumbled that the crime really did seem senseless. And as for the stolen necklace, for some reason it was impossible to track its location using magic. This made the supreme sorcerer think seriously. He still did not consider Maldenika Babaloa to be the culprit of what happened, but he could not help but admit that the further he went, the stranger this mystery became. When, having thought all this over, the first magician asked the second if he had ever seen a person in whose body two forces flowed simultaneously, from dragons and demons, Rasmus immediately answered that no. He did not have the gift of sensing the hidden talents of those around him. Then Isaac apologized for forgetfulness and allowed to fully concentrate on another task, incubating the dragon egg, and ordered to make every possible effort to this, because it depends only on the dragon whether it will be possible to find and punish the thief. This also made the dark-skinned brunette remember the legendary dragon curse of Maldenika, and he decided to find out more about it, and did not even pay attention to how his subordinate secretly ate the candy sent by Carrot. At least mentally, the man couldn't help but admit that he was indeed behaving very unusually. This was the first time in Isaac's life that he had thought for so long about a person other than, perhaps, himself. Meanwhile, Rasmus had finished sucking on the candy, and he was simply beside himself with delight. The simple sweetness actually turned out to be incredibly tasty, like divine ambrosia. And then he almost screamed in horror when he noticed how much his voice had changed, and the Archmage rolled his eyes in irritation, like, this is just a simple joke spell. Why didn't his subordinate even figure this out on his own? Naturally, the head of the magical order immediately felt a trace of a little magic, but he paid tribute to how well the candy was enchanted. And then he, firstly, ordered Rasmus to stop hysteria. His voice will return to its original state after some time. And secondly, let the search for the thief stop. The sorcerer below almost fell to the floor in surprise. Not only did Isaac suddenly decide to close his eyes to the strange, but very brazen crime against the tower, but he also began to smile again for the second time that day. This could have been a very beautiful and symbolic moment, but the servant ruined it mercilessly by asking in a displeased tone what mistake he had made this time, implying that the Archmage could not have had any other reason to grin. Then he also looked at the letter sent to Karate, read the question about whether the High Sorcerer had a lover, and clarified, was it really true that someone wanted to marry Isaac? But the brunette ordered him to stop talking nonsense. The man then began writing a response to the young agent. In his letter, he admitted that he was completely single, and therefore saw no reason to refuse such a tempting offer. The main thing was just to find out when and where the date would take place. For a few moments, the great wizard looked at what he had written, and then he smiled warmly and sincerely again, for the third time in one day, and perhaps more times than in his entire previous life. The very next day, the letter was delivered to Karate, and it even worried the boy. As it turned out, Isaac emphasized the word beloved very significantly in his sentences, clearly for good reason. At the same time, Maldenika herself looked at the crowd that had gathered near her house with a false and awkward smile. Dozens of townspeople, led by Lessa, having heard about the construction of a large children's store opposite, were outraged by this and decided to help their savior in any way possible. The innkeeper, speaking as a herald on behalf of the entire community, added that they had all spent a long time pondering over a decision before arriving at the best option. And then the woman opened her bag and showed the heroine its contents. It turned out to be a petition against the construction of a competing enterprise. And at first, the townspeople wanted to scrape together money so that the protagonist would simply buy it for herself. But they quickly discovered that they would never save up even half of the required amount. Lessa added that sending the petition would help delay the opening of the department store by about 2 weeks, and she had specifically consulted a professional in commercial law. And the man only sheepishly added that he had simply studied a little at a school for commoners. Meldanika, however, didn't say anything for now. She continued to clutch the bag in her hands and stared at it, as if she couldn't decide how to feel about such a thing. She never really intended to fight for some kind of general justice. She fought the pirates out of self-interest, and could not even imagine that she would receive glory as a heroine. Not to mention that these poor and naive people simply did not know what rumors were circulating about the protagonist among the aristocrats. The petition wasn't anonymous, so Lennox Guessman could easily track down each of its supporters and send thugs after them. But the townspeople decided to take the risk anyway, and the time traveler eventually bowed her head to them, thanking them for this act of kindness. She privately decided not to upset people by telling them how much shit the real Maldanika Babaloa had done in her time, and instead promised those around her that once the problem was solved, everyone could come to the party. People immediately began to recall who could play what musical instruments to make the celebration more fun, and one elderly and plump gentleman even admitted that, although he could not play music or dance, he could slap his stomach to create a pretty good drum rhythm. The protagonist politely declined the offer and immediately frowned while those around her were distracted. She had no illusions that the petition would have any effect. Bureaucrats are always on the side of those who have more money and influence, and in this, Guessman surpasses her by orders of magnitude. But this did not mean that the time traveler would just give up. Despite all the nuances, she valued and respected the efforts of other people too much, so she was going to swap the earth and sky, but make sure that their opinion was heard by the authorities. A little later, the author shifted the focus to the small nightly detachment of Maldanika. Axion, Marissa, and Carrot did not close their eyes at night, coming up with the best and most sophisticated ways to take revenge on Lennox for all the evil done to him. The girl, for example, took up real espionage. She listened intently and carefully to her older brother's conversations, and thus learned that he was planning to invest money in some project at the upcoming minor debut at the Academy. And this was a first-class opportunity to leave the villain with a hole in his donut instead of a surplus. The kids managed to make a special plan based on this data, and if everything goes right, the protagonist will completely eclipse Hessman. In fact, this plan turned out to be very simple. The boys and the girl wanted Maldanika to do some kind of trick, so cool that it would be remembered for a lifetime. And then, on a wave of impressions, they would spread the advertisement of the stationery store to the ends of the earth. In addition, they officially invited the time traveler to their academy because she is, to quote, "the most precious thing we have." Naturally, the girl was incredibly surprised, and then explained to readers that a small debut is something like a matinee, where children and early teenagers bring things from home and share them with each other to strengthen friendship. The only condition was that the gift had to be something truly dear to the old owner. And over time, this ceremony became a real celebration. Carrot, however, forgot that only nobles could participate in this, and he was a commoner, but his friends promised to please him in any case. The protagonist happily hugged the trio and decided to somehow congratulate them in return. And to do this, she had to find out the kids' tastes in a roundabout way. Soon, she received the necessary information and was ready to let her little friends go. But the young wizard decided to stay for a conversation. He admitted that he would like to introduce Mel to a certain friend after the audit, and upon learning that she was not against it, quickly ran away so as not to reveal the surprise ahead of time. Later, she and Dominic gathered in the kitchen. This time, the traveler decided to cook a special sweet dish that looked like a fluffy cloud, although the knight doubted that such a thing was possible. It also turned out that all this time, mercenaries were trying to attack the main character, but the warrior defeated her before the girl noticed anything, and since the magic contract made the users similar to each other, the man became more bloodthirsty than before, like Meldanika herself. This naturally frightened the blonde, but then she focused on interrogating the prisoner. He confessed that they were hired on behalf of the crazy aristocrat magician, Tellin, but the real customer was Hildegard. In the novel, Tellin was a real mad scientist who almost killed the real Babaloa. She only miraculously escaped from his lab. These two villains began working together for a simple reason. The Duchess saved the future killer's life when he was still a child. It was this bastard who kidnapped children, which attracted the attention of the Tower of Magicians,